My daughter-in-law tossed her muddy designer boots at my feet and demanded I scrub them on my knees. When my son walked in, he did not defend me. He gave me an ultimatum to either serve his wife or get out of my own house. I did not argue. I smiled, grabbed my suitcase, and walked out. 2 hours later, I had 38 missed calls. They had just discovered the true cost of their arrogance. I am Clifton, 70 years old, and I am still amazed by how quickly greed can erase a lifetime of love. As a self-made mechanic who built an empire of auto shops across Atlanta, I thought I had secured my family's future. I was wrong. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who mistook your silence for weakness. The mud dripped from the heels of Sydney's white designer boots, staining the hardwood floor I had polished just an hour ago. She did not take them off at the entryway. She walked directly into the kitchen right up to where I was drinking my morning coffee and kicked them off. They hit the leg of my wooden chair with a heavy thud. "Clean them, Clifton," she said, not looking up from her phone screen. I stepped in a puddle outside the country club, used the soft bristle brush. Those cost $1,000. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. "I am not your maid, Sydney. The cleaning supplies are under the sink." She finally looked up, her blue eyes narrowing in pure disbelief. "Excuse me, you live in my house. You eat the food Bryce pays for. The least you can do is make yourself useful instead of sitting around taking up space." Her hypocrisy was staggering. Sydney spent her days posting online videos about mindfulness, inner peace, and holistic wellness to her thousands of followers. Off camera, she treated anyone over the age of 60 like disposable garbage. She firmly believed that because I wore simple flannel shirts and spent my retirement tinkering with old engines in the garage, I was an uneducated burden. She conveniently ignored the fact that my hard work paid for the very foundation she stood on. Before I could answer her, Bryce walked into the kitchen. He was aggressively adjusting a silk tie around his neck, trying to look the part of a successful venture capitalist. He looked at the muddy boots on the floor, then looked directly at me. "Dad, just do what she asks," Bryce snapped, checking his expensive watch. "She has a massive launch party for her wellness brand to plan. We do not have time for your stubbornness today." I looked at my son. I saw a man who had grown up watching me scrub motor oil from my hands every night so he could attend private schools. Now he stood there in a tailored suit demanding I kneel before his wife. "I built my auto shops from the ground up, working with grease and sweat," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I have never knelt to wipe another person's shoes. I will not start today." Bryce's face flushed a deep, angry red. He stepped closer, pointing a rigid finger at my chest. "You sold your shops 10 years ago. You are nothing but a guest here. Either pick up those boots, apologize to my wife, and make yourself useful, or get out of my house." I thought I would argue. He thought I would plead, terrified of being a 70-year-old man thrown out onto the street. Bryce assumed that because I allowed him to pay the monthly utility bills and manage the daily maintenance of the estate, he somehow owned the property. He forgot who raised him. He forgot who actually held the deeds. I smiled. It was a small, cold smile that carried 40 years of business acumen. I stood up, walked down the hall to my bedroom, and grabbed the heavy leather suitcase I had packed 3 days ago. I had not packed it out of paranoia. I had packed it because I had noticed severe irregularities in the mail bank statements addressed to Bryce that were hastily shredded and hidden at the bottom of the recycling bin. I was already preparing for a storm. I walked back through the kitchen, stepping right over Sydney's muddy white boots, and headed straight for the front door. "If you walk out that door, do not ever come back," Bryce shouted from the hallway, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You are on your own." I did not turn around. I let the heavy mahogany door slam shut behind me. I did not take my truck from the driveway. I needed the crisp morning air to clear my mind. I walked 2 miles down the road to a quiet diner in the city center. I took a seat in a corner booth, ordered a slice of cherry pie, and asked the waitress for a fresh cup of black coffee. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated against the table. I ignored it. A minute later, it vibrated again. Then it began to ring incessantly. By the time I finished my slice of pie, I had exactly 38 missed calls from Sydney and 12 frantic text messages from Bryce. They were not calling to apologize for their behavior. They were calling because Sydney had just attempted to pay the $5,000 catering deposit for her lavish brand launch party, and the Platinum credit card had declined in front of the vendors. Bryce's last text message appeared on my screen. "Stop throwing a childish tantrum and unlock the primary account. The bank says the primary cardholder froze the entire line of credit. Do it right now." Bryce truly believed he owned the estate. He completely forgot that the estate, the operational accounts, and the platinum credit lines were entirely secured inside a bond trust under my name. I had given them authorized user cards to manage the household. I could revoke that authorization with a single phone call. I did not text my son back. I picked up my phone and dialed Elliot, my longtime corporate attorney. Elliot was a man who helped me navigate the brutal expansions of my business decades ago. He knew exactly how to dismantle a financial threat. Elliot, I said clearly over the diner's background noise. Lock the trust entirely. Cut their access to every single account, credit line, and emergency fund. Consider it done, Clifton Elliot replied immediately, the typing of his keyboard audible through the speaker. But Clifton, I just pulled the estate's preliminary title report to verify the asset lockdown. You need to come to my office right now. You need to see this. I set my coffee cup down. What did you find, Elliot? Bryce did not just overspend on his wife's vanity project. Elliot explained, his voice dropping an octave in sheer seriousness. He took out a $500,000 equity line of credit against your estate. Because the house is locked in your trust, he could not do it legally. Clifton, your son, forged your signature. I sat across the polished mahogany desk in Elliot's downtown office. The city noise outside was a dull hum against the thick glass, matching the steady thrumming in my chest. Elliot did not offer me coffee or pleasantries. He knew me too well for that. We had navigated union strikes, corporate buyouts, and franchise expansions together. He simply opened a heavily embossed folder and slid a stack of banking documents across the table. I picked up the top page. It was a finalized authorization for a $500,000 equity line of credit secured directly against my estate. The funds had been entirely routed to a corporate account registered to Sydney's wellness brand. My eyes traced the bottom line where my signature rested. It was a clumsy imitation of my handwriting. The slant of the capital C was entirely wrong. Bryce had not just overdrawn a credit card. He had gambled the very roof over my head for a failed internet business. He had walked into a financial institution and committed federal bank fraud. I stared at the ink, feeling a profound cold clarity wash over me. The boy I had taught to hold a wrench, the son whose college tuition I paid in cash earned from long nights covered in engine grease, had casually signed away my life's work. Elliot watched me intently, his hands folded on the desk. He told me the bank had initiated a routine internal audit due to the sudden massive withdrawal, which flagged the account lock I had just implemented. The pieces were locking into place. My son was drowning in debt, and he had tied an anchor to my ankle to save himself. I placed the forged document back onto the desk and aligned its edges perfectly with the folder. Elliot leaned forward and asked if I wanted him to call the authorities immediately to have Bryce arrested. I shook my head. A premature confrontation would only give Bryce and Sydney time to invent a convenient lie. They would claim it was a terrible misunderstanding, destroy the paper trail, and attempt to manipulate the narrative to make me look like an aggressive, confused old man. I refused to give them that opportunity. I told Elliot to let the bank proceed with their routine audit without interference. I wanted the fraud department to complete their federal review and secure undeniable proof. I wanted a federal paper trail that Bryce could not argue away with his slick corporate vocabulary. Elliot nodded in agreement, recognizing the exact same ruthlessness I used to outmaneuver rival auto chains decades ago. I instructed him to maintain the total freeze on all their accounts. Let them feel the crushing weight of their financial reality. Leaving the office, I did not return to the estate. I hailed a cab and directed the driver to a high-end, heavily secured hotel in the business district. I paid for a suite in cash. I needed a sterile, quiet environment to orchestrate my counterattack. Sitting in that pristine hotel room looking out over the Atlanta skyline, I felt absolutely zero guilt. My son had made his choices with a clear mind. He had treated my legacy as a disposable resource. I spent the afternoon organizing my legal binders, preparing for the inevitable fallout. I knew Bryce would panic the moment he realized the money was entirely blocked. I just did not anticipate how low his panic would drive him. The sun had barely set when a series of heavy, authoritative knocks hammered against my hotel room door. I set aside the financial ledgers I was reviewing and walked to the entryway. I opened the door to find two uniformed city police officers standing in the hallway, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. The older officer stepped forward, looking at me with a mixture of suspicion and pity. He asked if I was Clifton and requested my identification. I handed him my driver license without a word. He examined it, exchanged a quick glance with his partner, and told me they had received an emergency call from my son. Bryce had reported me as a vulnerable missing senior citizen suffering from advanced dementia. My own son had told the police dispatcher that I had wandered off from the estate in a state of severe confusion and posed a critical danger to myself. The strategy was brutally clear. Since I was not answering my phone to unlock the frozen bank accounts Bryce needed me physically dragged back to the house. He was attempting to use the local police department as his personal collection agency. He wanted to force me into a corner where my refusal to release the funds would look like the irrational behavior of a sick, senile man. He'd calculated that the police would take one look at a 70-year-old African-American man sitting alone in a hotel room and immediately believe the clean-cut, articulate businessman claiming to be his worried son. It was a vile, calculated manipulation of the law. I looked at the two officers, ensuring my posture was straight and my gaze unwavering. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I stepped back and politely invited the officers inside the suite. I walked over to the desk and picked up my meticulously organized legal binder. I handed the older officer a certified document. It was a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation I had completed just 3 weeks prior, necessary for updating my corporate insurance policies. The evaluation clearly stated I possessed absolute cognitive clarity and perfect mental health. I then showed them the banking alert proving I had intentionally frozen the estate accounts that morning due to fraudulent activity. I explained calmly that I had left my home because my son and daughter-in-law had demanded I act as their servant, and I had cut off their access to my wealth in response. This false missing persons report was simply their desperate retaliation. I watched the officers review the medical certificate and the banking freeze. The tension in their shoulders vanished, replaced instantly by grim realization. They recognized they had been entirely weaponized by a greedy relative. The older officer handed the documents back to me, apologizing sincerely for the intrusion. He stated I was clearly lucid and well within my rights to stay wherever I pleased. However, his expression darkened as he delivered one final piece of information. He warned me that Bryce had not merely called the police dispatch to locate me. Earlier that afternoon, my son had filed an emergency petition in family court for a temporary medical conservatorship. Bryce was actively moving to have a judge strip away my legal autonomy. He wanted the court to hand him complete control over my life, my assets, and my body to cover up his federal crimes. The officers wished me luck and quietly left the room. I stood alone in the silence, locking the door. The battle line was drawn. I picked up my phone to call Elliot again. I had to prepare for court. The heavy double doors of the Fulton County Family Court swung open with a muted thud. I did not enter immediately. I stood in the shadowed hallway with Elliot watching the proceeding through the narrow glass panel. Inside, Bryce and Sydney stood before the judge alongside a nervous, fast-talking attorney who looked like he billed by the hour from a strip mall office. Sydney was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue, playing the role of a heartbroken daughter-in-law utterly devastated by a family tragedy. Bryce stood tall, adopting a posture of heavy, burdensome responsibility. "Your Honor, my father is completely detached from reality." Bryce lied smoothly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "He wanders the streets at all hours. He is freezing essential household bank accounts out of severe paranoia. We desperately need medical guardianship to protect his assets and get him into a secure psychiatric facility before he hurts himself." The judge adjusted her glasses, looking down at the paperwork. "And where is the medical evidence of this sudden and severe cognitive decline?" she asked. Bryce prompted his lawyer, who hastily handed a single sheet of paper to the bailiff. "It is a preliminary assessment from a Dr. Aris," the lawyer stated. "The document clearly outlines that Mr. Jenkins shows advanced irreversible signs of cognitive decay and requires immediate institutionalization for his own safety." They had actually done it. My son stood in a court of law and presented a fabricated medical document to legally strip me of my human rights. He wanted me locked inside a sterile room, sedated and forgotten simply, so he could cover up his massive financial crimes. The sheer audacity of his greed extinguished any lingering warmth I held for the boy I had raised. I gave Elliot a brief nod. It was time to end the charade. I pushed open the courtroom doors and walked down the center aisle. My posture was perfectly straight, my steps measured and deliberate. I wore the same tailored charcoal suit I wore when negotiating multi-million-dollar real estate acquisitions. Elliot walked right beside me, clutching a thick, heavy leather briefcase. The sharp click of my leather shoes against the polished floor caused Bryce to turn around. The confident, sorrowful mask melted off his face instantly. His jaw went slack. Sydney stopped her fake crying, her hand freezing midway to her face as pure panic widened her eyes. "Your Honor," Elliot announced, his booming voice commanding the room before we even reached the defense table. I represent Mr. Clifton Jenkins. My client is not only fully competent and present today, but he is also the sole acting trustee of the Jenkins estate. The judge looked from the confident man standing before her to the nervous son, claiming I was a wandering hazard. Elliot approached the bench and handed over a thick, legally certified document with an embossed seal. I present a comprehensive psychiatric and physical evaluation completed just 3 weeks ago by the chief of neurology at Emory University Hospital. Elliot stated clearly, "It proves my client possesses absolute mental clarity and executive function." The cheap lawyer representing Bryce began to sweat, visibly shuffling his papers. The judge scanned the certified evaluation, her brow furrowing in deep confusion and growing anger. "Your Honor," Elliot continued, dropping the real bomb without missing a beat. "The medical assessment provided by the plaintiff is completely fraudulent. It is signed by a man who lost his medical license in the state of Florida 3 years ago for prescription fraud. He is a disgraced physician my client has never met in his entire life." The silence in the courtroom became suffocating. Sydney backed away from the table, staring at Bryce in sheer terror as the trap they built snapped shut on their own fingers. The judge glared sharply at Bryce's attorney, demanding an immediate explanation. The lawyer stammered, claiming he only submitted the documents provided by his clients. Furthermore, Elliot stated, projecting his voice so every word struck like a hammer, "My client did not freeze the trust accounts out of paranoia. He froze them because he discovered his son committed federal bank fraud. Last month, Bryce Jenkins forged my client's signature to secure a $500,000 fraudulent equity line of credit against the estate. They do not want to protect his health. They want a judge to hand them legal control of the trust before the bank's internal fraud department completes its routine audit this coming Friday." Bryce tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He looked around the room like a trapped animal, realizing there was no slick corporate vocabulary that could talk his way out of federal forgery. The judge slammed her gavel down with a resounding crack that made Sydney jump. "This petition for emergency conservatorship is denied with extreme prejudice." The judge declared, her voice laced with absolute disgust. "Mr. Jenkins, I am retaining these fabricated medical records and forwarding the allegations of the forged equity loan directly to the district attorney for an immediate criminal investigation. You are dismissed." Bryce's lawyer did not say a word. He grabbed his briefcase and practically sprinted out of the courtroom, desperate to distance himself from the impending felony charges. Bryce stood frozen, his chest heaving, the reality of a federal prison sentence finally crashing down on his shoulders. Sydney was shaking her designer clothes, suddenly looking entirely out of place in a court of law. I turned and walked back down the aisle. As I passed their table, I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I simply stopped for a fraction of a second, looked directly into Sydney's terrified blue eyes, and spoke loud enough for only her to hear. "You should have cleaned your own boots." I walked out of the double doors and into the bright Atlanta afternoon, breathing in the clean air of vindication. But the war was not entirely over. Denied legal control of my assets and facing imminent arrest. The moment the bank finished its audit, Bryce was entirely out of options. A desperate man drowning in a $500,000 debt does not simply surrender. He looks for anything left to steal, and his eyes quickly turned to the detached garage back at the estate, where my fully restored vintage automobile sat waiting. The denial of the conservatorship left my son entirely out of options. The federal bank audit on his forged equity line was steadily ticking down to Friday. A desperate man drowning in a $500,000 debt does not simply surrender. He looks for anything left to steal. Bryce set his sights on the detached garage located behind the main estate. Inside that climate-controlled building sat my pride and joy. It was a fully restored 1968 Chevrolet Mustang. I had spent 8 years rebuilding that engine with my own hands, sourcing original parts from across the country. Bryce knew I kept the keys locked in a specific cabinet. He also knew he could not sell a classic car without a title through any legitimate dealership. But Bryce was no longer operating in the legitimate world. He reached out to a shady broker he had met during his underground gambling days, a man who specialized in moving high-value assets across state lines without asking any legal questions. Bryce arranged a quick under-the-table cash sale. He was willing to sell a classic vehicle worth over $100,000 for a fraction of its value just to secure enough liquid cash to hire a criminal defense attorney or flee the state. He thought he had outsmarted me again. He assumed that because I was staying at a hotel downtown, the estate was completely unmonitored. He forgot that a man who builds businesses in his community also builds deep, lasting relationships. Marcus lived right across the street. We had been neighbors for 30 years. We had shared barbecues, watched our children grow up, and kept a close eye on each other's properties. Marcus was sitting on his front porch drinking sweet tea when an unmarked heavy-duty tow truck backed into my driveway. He watched two men jump out and head straight for my detached garage, accompanied by Bryce. Marcus knew immediately that something was wrong. I never allowed anyone to touch my Mustang, let alone load it onto a dirty flatbed. My phone rang just as I was finishing a meeting with Elliot in the hotel lobby. Marcus did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me exactly what was happening on my property. I thanked him, hung up, and immediately dialed the local police precinct. I requested emergency dispatch for an active grand theft auto in progress at my address. I did not wait for their confirmation. I grabbed my keys, rushed to my rental car, and sped toward the estate. I drove with the focused intensity of a man protecting his life's work. The drive usually took 30 minutes in afternoon traffic, but adrenaline and a deep knowledge of Atlanta's backroads cut that time in half. I navigated the familiar streets while picturing my son coordinating the theft of my prized possession. Bryce was not just stealing a car. He was stealing the thousands of hours I had spent under the hood, the quiet weekends I had enjoyed bringing that machine back to life. He was stripping away my memories for quick cash. I turned onto my street just as the police cruisers sped past me, their sirens wailing and lights flashing in the midday sun. We pulled into the long driveway in perfect synchronization. The unmarked tow truck was already idling the heavy steel ramp lowered to the ground. My beautifully restored cherry red Mustang was halfway up the ramp, its chrome bumper gleaming in the sunlight. The moment the black market broker heard the police sirens, he did not hesitate. He dropped the winch remote, sprinted across the manicured lawn, hopped the back fence, and vanished into the dense woods behind the neighborhood. He abandoned the truck and the deal entirely. Bryce was left standing frozen by the garage door, his face completely drained of color, as 4 police officers stepped out of their cruisers with their hands on their holsters. They ordered my son to step away from the vehicle and place his hands where they could see them. Bryce stammered, raising his hands defensively. He tried to put on his usual charming facade, telling the officers it was a simple misunderstanding and that he was just transporting his father's car to a specialized mechanic for maintenance. I stepped out of my vehicle and walked directly toward the officers. I pulled a folded, notarized document from my breast pocket. I introduced myself clearly and handed the officers the original unencumbered title to the vehicle. The paper proved I was the sole legal owner of the Chevrolet Mustang. I stated firmly that I had not authorized any transport, sale, or maintenance of my property. I told the officers my son was actively attempting to steal a vehicle valued at over $100,000 to cover his illicit debts. The lead officer looked at the title, then looked at Bryce. He commanded another officer to detain him. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping around Bryce's wrists echoed sharply across the quiet suburban driveway. Bryce stood against the side of the police cruiser, humiliated in broad daylight. Neighbors were peeking through their blinds, watching the successful venture capitalist reduced to a common car thief. He begged me to tell the officers to let him go, whispering frantically that an arrest record would destroy his remaining reputation. I looked at him without a single ounce of pity. The lead officer issued a severe, uncompromising warning. I explained that, because I was willing to handle this civilly, for the moment they would not transport Bryce to central booking for grand theft auto. However, they formally trespassed him from the garage and warned him that any further attempts to access my assets would result in immediate felony charges. I did not want my son arrested for stealing a car when the federal bank fraud charges were already looming. I wanted him to feel the absolute terror of having zero options. I hired a certified bonded transport service on the spot. They arrived within the hour. I watched them carefully load my Mustang and transport it to a high-security, climate-controlled storage facility downtown. I secured my last physical asset, cutting off Bryce's final lifeline. The police officers eventually uncuffed him and drove away, leaving my son standing alone in the middle of the empty driveway. His sleek designer suit looked ridiculous against the backdrop of his complete failure. He had absolutely no money, no leverage, and no way to generate the cash he desperately needed to avoid federal prison. He was entirely broken. But his wife was not ready to surrender. Humiliated and completely cut off from my wealth, Sydney decided to change her tactics. If she could not steal my money, she would destroy my reputation. She picked up her phone and decided to weaponize her internet followers against me. I sat in the quiet of my hotel room the next morning when my phone began to vibrate violently. It was not Bryce calling to apologize. It was a wave of notifications from social media. Sydney had decided that if she could not steal my money, she would destroy my name. I opened the link sent by one of my former shop managers. There was my daughter-in-law on the screen, sitting on the floor of my estate wearing minimal makeup to look exhausted and fragile. She was crying on camera for her 2 million followers. She told a completely fabricated story about a cruel, wealthy father-in-law who had suddenly lost his mind and frozen all her accounts out of pure spite. She cried about how she had welcomed me into her home, cared for me, and how I had repaid her kindness by leaving her and her husband completely destitute. She never mentioned the forged $500,000 loan. She never mentioned the muddy boots or the attempt to have me locked in a psychiatric ward. She painted herself as the ultimate victim of financial abuse. The video was a masterclass in manipulation, perfectly tailored for her wellness audience, who immediately rushed to her defense. By noon, the video had millions of views. The comment section was a flood of outrage directed entirely at me. People who had never met me were calling for my total ruin. They demanded my businesses be boycotted, completely unaware that I had sold them years ago. Sydney had effectively mobilized a digital army to attack a 70-year-old man, believing public pressure would force me to unlock the trust funds. She underestimated my resolve. The digital outrage quickly bled into my real life. My phone rang again, but this time it was not angry internet strangers. It was men and women I had known for decades. These were prominent figures in the local African-American business community, people I had mentored, invested with, and stood shoulder to shoulder with during hard economic times. One of my oldest colleagues, a man who owned a string of dealerships across the state, called me with genuine concern in his voice. He told me the video was spreading through local business networks. People were asking questions. Rumors were swirling that I had gone senile or turned my back on my own family. My pristine reputation, the name I had spent 40 years building with sweat and unwavering integrity, was being dragged through the mud by a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life. The backlash threatened to tarnish the legacy I intended to leave behind. It is a unique kind of pain to watch your life's work reduced to a villainous caricature on a glowing screen. Bryce stood by and allowed his wife to publicly humiliate the father who had given him everything. He hid behind her tears because he was too cowardly to face the federal consequences of his own actions. I felt the sting of their betrayal, but I did not let it control me. A lesser man might have panicked. A foolish man might have recorded a defensive video of his own to argue with a mob of strangers. I did neither. I knew that fighting a pig in the mud only gets you dirty, and the pig likes it. I turned my phone off. I drove directly to Elliot's office. I walked past his receptionist and handed him a tablet playing Sydney's tearful video. Elliot watched the performance with a look of absolute disgust. He immediately suggested we release a press statement detailing the forged loan and the grand theft auto attempt to clear my name. I shook my head and told him no. I refused to argue my family's private failures in the public square. I wanted to hit them where it actually mattered. I instructed Elliot to draft a massive defamation lawsuit against Sydney. We would wait until her wellness brand generated whatever small revenue it had left, and then we would seize every penny of it in a court of law. Her own video would become evidence in her financial ruin. Furthermore, it was time to finalize the physical consequence of their disrespect. I told Elliot to draft the official 30-day eviction notice for the estate. They had violated every term of my goodwill. I wanted them legally removed from my property. Elliot drafted the documents with ruthless efficiency. We coordinated with the county sheriff to ensure the eviction notice would be served with the full backing of law enforcement. I signed the paperwork with a steady hand. My silence to the public was not a surrender. It was the calm before a devastating storm. Sydney and Bryce interpreted my lack of a public response as a victory. They thought they had backed me into a corner. Their arrogance made them careless, and careless people always make fatal mistakes. That evening, I sat in my hotel room monitoring the situation through a newly created anonymous account. Sydney was hosting a live broadcast to celebrate her sudden surge in popularity. Thousands of people were tuning in to offer her sympathy and donations. She sat in the grand living room of my estate, sipping expensive sparkling water paid for by her gullible followers. She smiled triumphantly into the camera, her earlier tears completely vanished. She boasted about how she was not going to let toxic family members stop her from achieving her dreams. Then, blinded by her own vanity, she made a monumental error. She proudly announced to her audience that despite the financial cutoff, she was still hosting her massive wellness brand launch party that upcoming weekend. She held up a glossy gold-embossed invitation directly to the camera. The invitation clearly displayed the date, the time, and the address of my estate. She invited her most loyal followers to join the exclusive guest list, claiming she was reclaiming her space and taking her power back. She was planning to fill my home with investors, influencers, and strangers, projecting an illusion of wealth and success while actively under federal investigation for fraud. I paused the video and zoomed in on the invitation. I noted the exact starting time of the event. Sydney thought she was showing off her resilience to the world. She had absolutely no idea what she had just done. By broadcasting the details of her lavish party, Sydney had unknowingly provided me with the exact time and location to execute my ultimate counterattack. Sydney had broadcasted the exact location and time of her wellness brand launch to millions of followers. But broadcasting a lie is entirely different from financing it. With the primary trust completely locked down and Bryce's fraudulent equity line frozen by the bank, they were totally devoid of liquid capital. They had $0 to their names. Caterers, lighting technicians, and event staff demanded upfront payments before stepping foot on the property. A desperate narcissist does not cancel a high-profile party. She doubles down on the delusion. I monitored the estate's external security logs remotely from my hotel and saw the sudden arrival of unmarked black sport utility vehicles at the side gate. Sydney had reached out to underground lenders operating on the dark, dangerous fringes of Atlanta's nightlife. These were not men who asked for credit scores or signed polite corporate contracts. They were dangerous individuals who dealt exclusively in extortionate short-term cash loans and swift physical consequences. Sydney borrowed $60,000 in hard cash just to keep the catering trucks from driving away. She signed an agreement demanding full repayment within 48 hours with a massive interest rate, fully believing her own fabricated hype. She intended to dazzle high-net-worth investors at the party, secure immediate venture capital, and pay back the dangerous loan before the weekend ended. It was a massive, reckless gamble built on top of an already collapsing foundation of federal bank fraud. Bryce allowed his wife to borrow money from literal loan sharks, rather than admit his total financial failure to her face. They were digging a grave so deep that neither of them would ever climb out. The day before the event, Bryce and Sydney transformed my property into a grotesque monument to their vanity. Through the remote surveillance cameras, I watched delivery trucks drop off rented white leather furniture, massive floral arrangements, and professional stage lighting. They hired a team of private security guards to man the front gates dressed in sharp black suits, with earpieces strictly instructed to keep out anyone not on the exclusive guest list. They set up an enormous ice sculpture of Sydney's brand logo right in the center of the driveway. Sydney posted a constant stream of updates to her social media accounts, walking through the grand foyer of my home, running her hand along the mahogany staircase I had paid for with grease-stained hands decades ago. She looked into the camera and welcomed her followers to her private sanctuary, claiming she and her husband had designed the space to reflect their successful, mindful lifestyle. Bryce strutted across the lawn, directing the installation of a towering champagne fountain. He acted with the supreme confidence of a self-made billionaire, entirely ignoring the fact that federal agents were actively preparing an indictment with his name printed on it. They were selling a complete fantasy to the public, building an empire of smoke and mirrors right on top of my life's work. They believed that if they just looked wealthy enough for one single night, the reality of their crushing debt and impending arrests would magically disappear. I watched the final crystal chandelier being hung in the garden tent, noting the sheer arrogant scale of the illusion they had constructed. While Bryce supervised the delivery of rented caviar and premium vodka, I sat in a sterile conference room at the county sheriff department alongside Elliot. The sheriff, a stern man with 30 years of law enforcement experience, reviewed the stack of authenticated documents on the metal table. Elliot presented the finalized 30-day eviction notice formally signed and sealed by the county judge that morning. Hun then produced the active federal arrest warrants issued by the district attorney regarding the forged $500,000 equity loan. We laid out the undeniable proof of the stolen vintage car attempt and the false missing persons report Bryce had filed earlier in the week. The sheriff examined the forged signature on the banking documents, his jaw tightening with professional disgust. I did not ask for a quiet, subtle resolution. I requested a highly visible, undeniable execution of the law. We coordinated the exact timing of our arrival to maximize the legal impact and ensure the safety of the civilian guests attending the party. The sheriff agreed to dispatch 4 squad cars to the estate precisely at 8 o'clock that evening. This was the exact moment Sydney was scheduled to give her keynote speech to her investors. We meticulously planned the approach to secure the perimeter. 2 cruisers would block the main front gates, while 2 more would secure the rear service entrance, before the private security team could interfere or warn Bryce of the impending raid. Elliot packed the documents back into his leather briefcase with a satisfying snap. The legal machinery was fully armed, aimed directly at the heart of their fraudulent gala. I returned to my hotel suite as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the Atlanta skyline. I took a hot shower, washing away the tension of the past few grueling days. I walked to the closet and retrieved the tailored charcoal suit I had purchased years ago. It was the same suit I wore when I opened my very first flagship auto repair center, a garment that represented the hard-earned triumph of a man who built his worth from absolute scratch. I buttoned my crisp white shirt and adjusted my silk tie with slow, deliberate movements. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and inspected my reflection. I did not see an old, confused man ready to be locked inside a psychiatric ward. I saw a man in total control of his environment. I reviewed the final copies of the eviction documents resting on the desk. I felt absolutely zero anxiety. There was no racing heartbeat, no second guessing, and no lingering guilt about destroying my son's public image. I felt only cold precision. Bryce and Sydney had crossed every conceivable boundary of respect and legality. They had treated my kindness as a weakness to be exploited. I checked my gold pocket watch. The hour was rapidly approaching. I folded the documents, slid them into the inside breast pocket of my jacket, and walked out the door. The massive party had just begun. Hundreds of VIP guests, wealthy investors, and social media influencers were currently filling the manicured grounds of my estate, drinking champagne funded by dangerous criminals. I arrived at the towering wrought iron front gates, ready to reclaim exactly what belonged to me. I approached the towering wrought iron gates of my own estate. The rented private security guards stood like statues in their sharp black suits, earpieces glowing in the dim evening light. They were instructed to keep out anyone not on Sydney's exclusive guest list. But these were local men from a firm I had contracted for years during my auto shop expansions. The lead guard, Marcus's nephew, recognized me instantly. He did not ask for an invitation. He simply gave a respectful nod and signaled the others to open the heavy gates. The gravel crunched beneath my leather shoes as I walked up the long driveway, passing the ridiculous ice sculpture of Sydney's logo melting onto the cobblestones. I pushed open the solid oak front doors. The grand ballroom was unrecognizable, draped in sheer white fabrics and flooded with flashing stage lights. Waiters navigated through a sea of wealthy investors and social media influencers. At the far end of the room, standing on a raised acrylic platform, Sydney held a silver microphone. She was wearing a sparkling emerald gown radiating false humility. She spoke to the captivated crowd about the grueling journey of building her wellness empire from scratch. She wove a beautiful lie about overcoming adversity, about late nights and early mornings, and about creating a sanctuary of healing in this very home that she and her husband had supposedly designed. She raised a crystal flute of champagne, preparing to toast to her self-made success. I did not wait for the applause. I stepped fully into the light of the ballroom, letting the heavy doors shut firmly behind me. The sharp echo cut through the ambient music, and the sea of guests instinctively parted as I walked straight down the center aisle. Bryce spotted me first. The arrogant smile vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden violent panic. He nudged Sydney, who nearly dropped her champagne flute when her eyes locked onto mine. Bryce sprinted down the steps of the platform, intercepting me halfway across the ballroom. He grabbed my forearm, his grip painfully tight, and tried to force me toward the side exit. "What are you doing here?" he hissed through clenched teeth, keeping his voice low so the nearby investors would not hear. "I told you this property is off limits today. You need to turn around and walk out that door right now, or I will have security drag you out." Sydney hurried over, her emerald gown dragging against the floor. "Dad, you are completely ruining my launch," she whispered frantically, her eyes darting toward the murmuring crowd. "You are having an episode. If you do not leave quietly, we are calling the police to have you committed." I looked at the hands grabbing my suit jacket. These were the hands of a desperate boy and a greedy woman who had borrowed $60,000 from loan sharks to fund a fairy tale. I smoothly detached my arm from his grip with a sharp, practiced motion. I did not engage in their panicked whispering. I did not acknowledge their hollow threats about law enforcement. I walked right past them, ascending the short stairs to the acrylic stage. The audience watched in total confusion as I stood in front of the massive floral arrangement. I reached out and took the silver microphone directly from Sydney's trembling hand. She was too shocked to resist. The feedback whined sharply through the massive speakers, silencing the entire room instantly. Hundreds of eyes stared up at me, waiting for the confused old man to embarrass himself. "Good evening," I said, my voice projecting clearly and steadily across the expansive ballroom. "I am Clifton. I am the sole legal owner of this estate, the property you are currently standing on." The murmurs rippled through the crowd, a wave of confusion washing over the influencers and venture capitalists holding their expensive drinks. Sydney stood frozen behind me, her face completely drained of color. Bryce remained paralyzed at the bottom of the stairs. I understand you were just treated to a compelling story about a self-made empire built from scratch. I continued pacing slowly across the stage. However, as investors, you deserve complete transparency regarding where your capital is going. This wellness brand was not built on hard work. It was built on federal bank fraud. Gasps erupted from the front row. Several prominent investors lowered their glasses, their expressions hardening into serious concern. 2 weeks ago, my son forged my signature to secure a $500,000 equity line of credit against this very house, I announced, ensuring every syllable struck like a hammer. He attempted to use my life's work as collateral to fund this lavish party and the brand you are being asked to support tonight. The bank has completely frozen their accounts. They possess zero liquid assets. Furthermore, they are currently under active investigation by federal authorities for financial crimes and forgery. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The illusion of wealth, the rented white leather furniture, the premium vodka, and the towering champagne fountain suddenly looked like the desperate props of a criminal enterprise. The investors began looking at each other, the reality of the situation rapidly setting in. Sydney tried to step forward to grab the microphone, but she was interrupted by the heavy front doors swinging open a second time. Elliot marched into the ballroom holding his thick leather briefcase. Flanking him was the county sheriff, fully uniformed, accompanied by 2 deputies. The sight of law enforcement sent a shockwave of panic through the remaining guests. The sheriff walked directly past the frozen crowd and stopped right in front of Bryce. "Are you Bryce Jenkins?" the sheriff demanded, his voice booming with unquestionable authority. Bryce could only muster a weak, trembling nod. The sheriff pulled a thick stack of folded documents from his belt. "You are hereby served with an immediate 30-day eviction notice for this property mandated by the legal trustee. Furthermore, you are officially served with a federal summons for bank fraud, forgery, and grand larceny." The sheriff shoved the heavy packet into Bryce's hands. The papers slipped from his loose grip, scattering across the polished hardwood floor. That was the absolute breaking point for the room. High-net-worth individuals do not stick around for federal indictments. The lead investor, a man who had been preparing to write a massive check just 10 minutes prior, set his glass down on a cocktail table and walked straight toward the exit. The rest of the crowd followed instantly. It was a stampede of luxury suits and designer dresses fleeing a sinking ship. The caterers stopped serving. The lighting technicians began packing their gear. Within 5 minutes, the grand launch party collapsed into an empty, echoing hall littered with abandoned champagne flutes. I stood on the stage watching the destruction of their false empire. Bryce stared at the legal summons on the floor. His breathing became heavy, ragged, and violent. Facing imminent prison time and total financial ruin, the fear in his eyes morphed into a raw, unfiltered rage. He did not look up at me. He turned his head slowly, locking his furious gaze entirely on his wife. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind the last fleeing investor, sealing the grand ballroom in a suffocating quiet. The string quartet had abandoned their instruments on the stage, leaving their cellos and violins resting against the velvet chairs. The catering staff moved with frantic efficiency, clearing away sterling silver trays and sweeping up shattered champagne flutes from the polished hardwood floor. The towering ice sculpture of Sydney's wellness logo, once the glittering centerpiece of the room, was now rapidly melting into a puddle of murky water on the marble tiles. I stood silently near the arched entryway, my hands folded calmly behind my back. I wore the same charcoal suit I had worn when I negotiated my first commercial garage expansion. Now I wore it to witness the collapse of my son's fraudulent empire. Bryce stood perfectly still in the center of the room. The legal summons in his hands shook violently. His tailored tuxedo seemed to hang loosely on his frame, as if the sudden reality of federal prison had physically shrunk him. Sydney was slumped against a rented white leather sofa. The emerald gown that had sparkled brilliantly just 10 minutes ago now looked like a cheap, discarded costume. The illusion they had so desperately constructed was dead. There were no cameras flashing, no influencers cheering, and absolutely no venture capitalists left to impress. They were stripped of their audience and left alone with the staggering weight of their crimes. I watched them closely. A united front built on greed is always fragile. When the money vanishes and the consequences arrive, thieves do not comfort each other. They turn on each other. I did not have to say a single word to initiate the destruction. I simply waited for the inevitable fracture. The fracture happened faster than I anticipated. Bryce violently crumpled the federal summons and hurled it across the room. He spun around and marched directly towards Sydney. His face was contorted with a raw, unfiltered rage I had never seen in him before. He pointed a trembling finger at her face and began to scream. He blamed her entirely. He shouted that her relentless obsession with social media fame had driven them into this nightmare. He claimed she had relentlessly harassed him for capital. They did not have demanding luxury they could not afford until he was forced to forge my signature just to silence her constant complaints. Sydney stared at him, her eyes wide with shock as the man she married threw her to the wolves to save his own skin. The county sheriff and his deputies were still standing near the foyer documenting the scene. Bryce turned his manic energy toward them. I desperately tried to rewrite history right in front of law enforcement. He swore to the sheriff that Sydney was the actual mastermind behind the entire fraud scheme. He claimed she had researched the equity line of credit, downloaded the forms, and manipulated him into presenting them to the bank. He begged the officers to note that she was the primary beneficiary of the stolen $500,000, insisting his only crime was being a foolish, supportive husband. I was willing to send his own wife to a federal penitentiary if it meant he could shave a few years off his impending sentence. It was a pathetic, cowardly display. He had inherited none of the backbone I had tried to instill in him. Sydney did not cower. The shock on her face vanished instantly, replaced by a venomous fury. She shot up from the leather sofa, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor as she closed the distance between them. She laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the empty ballroom. She looked at the sheriff, then directly at me before turning her wrath back onto her husband. She screamed that Bryce was a pathetic liar. She revealed that my son had not spent the entire $500,000 on her wellness brand. She confessed that her business had only received half of the stolen funds. The rest of the money had vanished into the shadows of Atlanta's criminal underground. Sydney exposed the dark reality Bryce had fought so desperately to hide. My son had developed a severe gambling addiction. He had lost over $250,000 betting on illegal offshore sports syndicates. When his initial losses piled up, he kept doubling down, convinced he could win back the deficit before anyone noticed. The forged equity loan was never just about funding a launch party. It was a desperate, panicked move to pay off dangerous bookmakers who were threatening to break his legs. Sydney stood in the center of the room, tearing down his corporate facade piece by piece. She told the police that Bryce was a degenerate gambler who used her business as a convenient money laundering front. The room grew incredibly tense. The deputies immediately unclipped their radios, noting the new allegations of illegal syndicate involvement. Bryce's grand plan was completely exposed, leaving him naked to the law and vulnerable to the streets. I stood by the doorway and absorbed the brutal truth. The boy I had raised, the son whose college education I had funded through decades of honest labor, was heavily indebted to the worst kind of criminals. He had not just risked my home, he had invited violent syndicates into our lives. Bryce realized his wife had just signed his death warrant. He turned away from the officers and ran toward me. He dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor, grabbing the fabric of my trousers. The arrogance he had displayed in the kitchen just weeks ago was completely gone. He begged me to intervene. He sobbed, pleading with me to unlock the trust funds and pay off the illegal bookmakers. He swore that the syndicates would kill him if the debt was not settled by the end of the month. He asked me to save his life. I looked down at the man kneeling at my feet. I felt a deep, profound sorrow for the child he used to be, but I felt zero obligation to the criminal he had become. I stepped back, forcing his hands off my suit. I told him in a clear, unwavering voice that I would not spend a single dime of my hard-earned wealth to subsidize his illegal gambling. I refused to negotiate with syndicates. I told him he had dug his own grave and now he had to lie in it. The police stepped forward to formally escort them off the property, but the legal system was no longer their most immediate threat. During the chaos of the party crashing, several guests had live-streamed the entire confrontation. The footage of their public eviction and financial ruin was currently spreading across the internet. The dangerous men Sydney had borrowed $60,000 from just 48 hours prior were watching the broadcast. They realized the wellness brand was a sham, and their money was gone. They decided it was time to collect their dues personally. The fallout from the live stream was instantaneous. Sydney had broadcasted her humiliation to millions, but she forgot that her audience included the very dangerous men who had financed her illusion. I was standing in my study watching the security monitors when two matte black sport utility vehicles skidded to a halt outside the main wrought iron gates of the estate. They did not wait for an invitation. The heavy doors of the vehicles swung open, and four heavily built men stepped out onto the damp pavement. These were not the tailored venture capitalists who had fled the ballroom earlier that evening. They were the underground lenders Sydney had sought out when she was desperate for quick cash to pay her caterers. They moved with a predatory, synchronized aggression. One of them, a man with a thick neck and a dark leather jacket, walked directly to the intercom and pressed the buzzer repeatedly, not lifting his finger. They had watched the viral collapse of the launch party in real time. They knew the wellness brand was a complete sham. The investors had walked out and their $60,000 was gone. Underground syndicates do not file lawsuits in civil court when they are defrauded. They collect their dues personally using fear and physical leverage. The men began shaking the iron gates, testing the electronic lock. They expected to find a terrified influencer and a cowardly husband cowering inside the mansion. They intended to force their way inside and strip the house of anything valuable to cover the massive debt. I watched their aggressive posturing through the high-definition camera feed. I did not call the police dispatch. I had already dealt with the law today. I buttoned my suit jacket, picked up a specific legal folder from my desk, and walked out the front door to handle this myself. I stepped out onto the expansive front porch, the motion sensor floodlights illuminating the driveway and the gates beyond. The four men stopped shaking the iron bars and stared at me. The man in the leather jacket shouted through the bars, demanding immediate entry. He claimed my daughter-in-law owed his employers a substantial amount of money and threatened that if I did not open the gate, they would drive their vehicle straight through the metal and seize the assets inside by force. He rattled off a list of luxury furniture and electronics he planned to strip from the house. I walked down the cobblestone path until I stood just a few feet away from the iron barrier. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I had negotiated with cutthroat union bosses and hostile corporate raiders for 40 years. 4 thugs attempting to intimidate me on my own property did not elevate my pulse. I told them clearly that breaking through my gate would be a fatal mistake. I slipped the folder from under my arm and slid a set of officially stamped documents through the narrow gap in the iron bars. I instructed the lead enforcer to read the paperwork before he made a decision that would land him in federal prison. The man snatched the papers, shining a heavy flashlight onto the pages. I explained that the documents were certified deeds and irrevocable trust records. They proved unequivocally that the entire estate, the land, the structure, and everything inside it belonged exclusively to me. Sydney and Bryce did not own a single blade of grass on this property. They could not use the house as collateral, and the men could not legally seize anything behind these gates to settle her debt. The leader scanned the documents, his heavy brow furrowing, as he processed the legal reality. I did not stop there. I handed him a second set of papers through the bars. I informed the men that my son and daughter-in-law had been officially and legally evicted from the premises just hours ago by the county sheriff. I told them Bryce and Sydney held absolutely zero assets, no bank accounts, no properties, and no hidden wealth. The second stack of papers I provided contained the printed copies of Bryce's federal indictments for bank fraud and forgery. I made sure these men understood that the couple who owed them money were currently entirely broke and actively being hunted by federal prosecutors. The syndicate enforcer looked at the federal stamps on the fraud charges. The aggressive posturing immediately drained from his stance. These men operated in the shadows. The absolute last thing an underground lending syndicate wants is to entangle themselves with property that is actively being monitored by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Seizing assets from a federally flagged estate would bring an army of federal agents directly to their doorstep. The leader handed the trust documents back to me, keeping the copies of the fraud charges. He realized instantly that I was completely untouchable and that the house was a dead end. They could not touch the estate, and they could not extort a man who held all the legal cards. The anger shifted abruptly from the property to the people who had actually stolen their money. I told them I did not care how they handled their business with my son, but they were never to return to my gates again. The leader gave a sharp nod of understanding. He signaled his men, and they immediately turned their attention away from the estate. They climbed back into their matte black vehicles, the tires screeching against the asphalt as they sped away into the night. They were no longer focused on seizing luxury furniture. They were actively hunting down Bryce and Sydney to collect their $60,000 by any means necessary. Somewhere in the city, Bryce was walking the streets with nothing but the clothes on his back and the terrifying realization that his world had completely collapsed. The news of the syndicate mobilization reached him quickly through the dark network of contacts he had built during his gambling days. He knew these men did not negotiate extensions or care about his federal troubles. They only cared about cash, and since he had none, they would take their payment in blood. Bryce realized he was no longer safe in any hotel, any friend's apartment, or anywhere in the city limits. The law was hunting him for $500,000 in bank fraud, and the underground was hunting him for his gambling and his wife's reckless loan. Panic consumed him entirely. He managed to scrape together a few items, shoving whatever he could into a cheap canvas duffel bag. He ran through the shadowed alleys of Atlanta, jumping at every passing pair of headlights, a self-proclaimed venture capitalist, reduced to a terrified fugitive. He had burned every bridge, destroyed his marriage, and alienated every person who ever cared for him. He was completely out of options, exhausted, freezing, and hunted by dangerous men. Bryce made a desperate decision. He returned to the one place he thought he could still manipulate, the one place he believed would always offer him a shield. The grandfather clock in my study struck 2 in the morning. I sat in my leather armchair reviewing a stack of quarterly reports from the automotive franchise I had sold years ago. The heavy rain battered the reinforced glass of the windows, washing away the remnants of the chaotic evening. My house was finally quiet. The fabricated glamour of the launch party was gone, replaced by the sturdy, familiar silence I had earned. Then, the high-definition security monitor on my desk chimed a sharp double tone. I set my reading glasses aside and looked at the screen. The cameras at the rear service gate had detected motion. The infrared feed cut through the heavy downpour, illuminating a figure pacing erratically on the wet pavement. It was Bryce. My son was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant venture capitalist who had worn a tailored suit just hours prior. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his shivering frame. He clutched a cheap canvas duffel bag against his chest like a shield. He kept darting his eyes toward the street, flinching at every passing shadow and the distant flash of headlights. The men from the underground syndicate were actively hunting him, and he knew they operated without mercy. He had exhausted every favor, burned every bridge, and realized his superficial friends from the country club would never open their doors to a man wanted by federal agents. He stumbled toward the heavy iron gate and slammed his hand against the intercom button, holding it down in sheer panic. I watched the water drip from his face. I did not feel a sudden surge of paternal instinct to rush out into the storm. I felt the solemn, heavy weight of a judge about to deliver a final verdict. I reached forward and pressed the audio receiver on my desk. "Dad, are you there?" Bryce's voice cracked through the small speaker, distorted by the static of the rain and his own uncontrollable sobbing. "Please tell me you are awake. You have to let me inside. They are looking for me." I heard the sheer terror vibrating in his throat. He pressed his face against the cold iron bars, desperately seeking the warmth of the property he had tried to steal. "I told you never to return to this estate," I replied, my voice projecting through the outdoor speaker with absolute unwavering clarity. "You have been legally evicted by the county sheriff. You are trespassing." Bryce fell to his knees in the mud. He gripped the iron bars with both hands, his knuckles turning white. "I know what I did, Dad. I know I messed up. I will turn myself in to the federal prosecutors tomorrow morning, I swear to you. But I will not survive the night out here. The men Sydney borrowed from, they do not care about the law. They are going to kill me. I just need a place to hide until the sun comes up." He gasped for air, wiping a mixture of rain and tears from his face. "I will not come into the main house. I will not touch anything. Just unlock the service gate and let me sleep in the unfinished basement. I just need the basement, Dad. Please." The irony of his request hung heavily in the cold air. The man who had sneered at my tools, who had ordered me to move my cot into the damp underground so his wife could host her fake investors, was now begging on his knees for that exact same concrete floor. I looked at the digital feed, studying the pathetic, trembling figure of my son. He expected me to cave. He relied on the fundamental assumption that a father will always shield his child from the ultimate harm. He believed that my love was a weakness he could exploit one last time. I leaned closer to the microphone. "The basement is incredibly damp, son," I told him, throwing his exact words from yesterday morning right back into his full. "The moisture will absolutely ruin your joints. I cannot allow you to live down there." Bryce let out a wounded, suffocating gasp. He realized I was not offering a rescue. I was holding up a mirror. "Dad, please do not do this to me. I am your flesh and blood. I am your only son. You are a man who forged my signature to gamble away my home," I corrected him sharply. "You are a man who falsified a medical report to lock me inside a psychiatric ward so you could cover up your federal crimes. You brought dangerous, violent criminals to my front gate. Shielding you from the consequences of your actions is exactly what created this monster. If I open this gate, you will never learn the cost of your arrogance. I spent 40 years pulling you out of every minor scrape. I bought your cars, funded your education, and gave you a pristine legacy on a silver platter. You took all of it and threw it into the mud. You made your choices with absolute clarity, Bryce. Now you must survive them." I took my finger off the transmission button, letting the silence of the decision settle over the estate. Bryce screamed my name into the intercom, pounding his fists against the iron gate until his knuckles bled. I reached over and permanently severed the audio feed. The speaker went dead. I sat in my comfortable armchair watching the monitor as the reality of his total isolation finally crushed him. Bryce stared at the unmoving gate for a long time. He realized the security light was not going to flash green. The heavy iron would not swing open. He slowly picked up his soaked duffel bag from the mud, pulling his wet collar tight against the freezing wind. He turned his back on the estate and began walking down the dark, empty road, completely cut off from his safety net, stepping into the terrifying world he had created for himself. Meanwhile, miles away on the dilapidated edge of the city, Sydney was sitting on the edge of a stained mattress in a cheap cash-only motel. She had fled the ballroom in a taxi, using the last $40 in her designer purse. She was shivering furiously, scrolling through her phone as the internet relentlessly mocked the viral collapse of her launch party. Her investors had blocked her number. Her fake friends had abandoned her. The loan sharks were hunting her husband. But Sydney was a narcissist entirely incapable of accepting defeat. She stared at the peeling wallpaper, her mind racing for a solution. She remembered the heavy steel safe hidden behind the oak panels in the master suite of my estate. She knew it held Evelyn's priceless antique jewelry collection. She decided she was not going to run away empty-handed. She formulated a desperate plan to break into the house, steal the jewelry, and buy her own escape. The storm continued to batter the city long after Bryce walked away from my gate. 10 miles away, his wife was realizing that her carefully curated digital life could not shield her from physical consequences. Sydney sat on the edge of a stained mattress in a cash-only motel room, staring at the peeling floral wallpaper. The dangerous men who had lent her $60,000 were not known for their patience. They would find her soon. She had completely exhausted her credit, alienated her followers, and watched her husband flee into the night. But Sydney possessed a relentless, toxic survival instinct. Her mind scrambled for a lifeline and landed directly on the memory of my late wife. Evelyn had a deep appreciation for antique jewelry. During our 40 years of marriage, I had gifted her rare Victorian brooches, diamond tennis bracelets, and an exquisite South Sea pearl necklace. Sydney had always coveted that collection. During family dinners, her eyes would lock on to Evelyn's pearls with barely concealed envy. Sydney knew those pieces were kept in a heavy mahogany armoire inside the master suite. She calculated that selling even one of those necklaces to an underground fence would yield enough untraceable cash to buy a one-way ticket out of the country. Desperation replaced whatever shred of morality she had left. She abandoned the motel room, using the last of her hidden emergency cash to secure a battered rental car under a false name. She drove through the blinding Atlanta rain, navigating the slick roads back toward my estate. She convinced herself that an old man sleeping alone in a massive house would be an easy target. She believed she could simply walk in, take what she wanted, and vanish before dawn. Sydney parked the rental car 2 blocks down the street, hiding it beneath the thick canopy of weeping willows. She pulled the hood of her dark rain jacket over her head, completely abandoning the polished influencer aesthetic that defined her public existence. She crept along the perimeter of my estate, keeping her body pressed against the wet brick walls to avoid the motion sensor floodlights. The heavy downpour masked the sound of her footsteps as she navigated toward the rear patio. She approached the tall French doors that opened into the main dining room. She assumed my security measures were outdated. During the years she and Bryce lived under my roof, they had frequently mocked my reluctance to install smart home devices, calling me a relic of a bygone era. They had no idea that the very morning I returned from my hotel, I had contracted a premium private security firm to completely overhaul the estate. State-of-the-art infrared sensors, glass break detectors, and silent alarms were seamlessly integrated into every entry point. Sydney wrapped her sleeve around her fist. She picked up a heavy decorative stone from the garden bed and smashed it through the glass pane nearest to the brass handle. The glass shattered inward, scattering across the hardwood floor. She reached her arm through the jagged opening, unlocked the deadbolt, and slipped inside. She stood in the dark dining room, breathing heavily, entirely convinced she had breached the fortress undetected. She pulled out her smartphone and turned on the flashlight application, sweeping the narrow beam across the familiar hallway. She had absolutely no idea that the moment the glass fractured, a silent alarm had instantly transmitted a priority alert to my monitoring system and the private security dispatch. I was sitting in the quiet comfort of my study when the high-definition monitors mounted above my desk flashed a brilliant warning red. The localized notification system pinged softly in my ear. I leaned forward, bringing the patio camera feed to the main screen. I watched the grainy night vision footage as Sydney crept through my dining room like a common thief. The sheer audacity of her actions sent a cold wave of anger through my chest. She was not just trespassing on my property. She was actively marching toward the master suite to violate the sacred memory of my wife. A younger, more volatile man might have grabbed the heavy steel flashlight from the desk drawer and confronted her in the dark hallway. I chose a much more devastating weapon. I picked up the telephone and dialed the emergency dispatch line directly. I identified myself clearly, provided my exact address, and reported a verified home invasion in progress. I informed the dispatcher that the intruder was currently on the ground floor moving toward the west wing and that I was secured safely inside a locked study. The dispatcher assured me that multiple units were already en route. I hung up the phone and returned my attention to the monitors. I watched Sydney navigate the corridor, her flashlight beam bouncing off the family portraits she had once pretended to care about. She reached the heavy oak doors of the master suite. She gripped the handle, pushed her way inside, and vanished from the hallway camera. She was marching directly into her own destruction, completely blind to the fact that I was orchestrating her downfall from a room just 50 feet away. Inside the master suite, Sydney found the heavy mahogany armoire exactly where Evelyn had left it. She frantically yanked the drawers open, tossing carefully folded silk scarves and velvet boxes onto the floor. Her trembling hands finally found the heavy velvet-lined jewelry case. She did not bother to sort through the rings or brooches. She immediately grabbed Evelyn's signature South Sea pearl necklace, clutching the smooth stones tightly in her fist. She shoved the necklace deep into her jacket pocket, her chest heaving with the adrenaline of a successful theft. She turned around to make her escape. Before she could even reach the bedroom door, the estate was bathed in an explosion of flashing red and blue lights. The piercing wail of police sirens cut through the heavy rain surrounding the property from every angle. Sydney froze in absolute terror. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a freight train. She abandoned all stealth, sprinting wildly down the hallway and bursting through the shattered French doors. She bolted across the wet grass of the backyard, desperate to reach the tree line. She did not make it past the stone fountain. 3 police officers intercepted her on the back lawn, blinding her with high-powered tactical flashlights. They ordered her to the ground with booming, undeniable authority. Sydney collapsed into the mud, sobbing hysterically as the officers forced her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly over the sound of the rain. An officer pulled her upright and conducted a rapid search, pulling Evelyn's pearl necklace directly from her soaked pocket. The physical evidence of her felony was undeniable. Sydney realized that a grand larceny charge would guarantee her a long sentence in a state penitentiary. Desperate to avoid being thrown into the back of a freezing police cruiser, she looked wildly at the arresting officers and screamed out that she was 4 months pregnant. Sydney's face was pressed against the wet grass of my back lawn. The cold metal handcuffs locked tightly around her wrists. The reality of a grand larceny charge crashed over her. She knew she was facing years in a state penitentiary. Desperation breeds monstrous lies. She twisted her body and screamed at the arresting officers that she was 4 months pregnant. She shrieked that the physical trauma of the arrest and the shock of being thrown into a freezing holding cell would cause an immediate miscarriage. She weaponized the officers' liability against them. Law enforcement protocols regarding pregnant suspects are incredibly strict. The lead officer paused, shining his heavy tactical flashlight on her tear-streaked face. He could not take the risk of endangering an unborn child, even if the mother was a caught felon with stolen pearls in her pocket. He radioed dispatch and requested an immediate medical transport. Instead of being shoved into the back of a police cruiser and driven to central booking, Sydney was loaded into a warm ambulance. She was transported to the nearest hospital under police guard for a mandated medical clearance. I sat in my study watching the entire performance through the high-definition security monitors. I watched the flashing red and blue lights fade down the long driveway. I did not feel a sudden surge of grandfatherly concern. I knew my son and daughter-in-law. I knew their limitless capacity for deception. More importantly, I remembered a quiet, devastating conversation Bryce and I had 5 years ago in my auto shop. He had confessed to a severe medical condition that made natural conception virtually impossible without intense, specialized clinical intervention. Sydney was not pregnant. She was playing a highly calculated legal game to buy herself time. I did not wait for the hospital to process her intake. I immediately picked up my phone and dialed my private investigator, a former federal agent named Vance, who had assisted me with deep background checks during my corporate acquisitions. I explained the situation clearly. I told Vance that Sydney had just claimed a 4-month pregnancy to avoid jail, and I needed her recent activities scrubbed clean before sunrise. Vance required no further explanation. John had a massive network of digital forensics experts at his disposal. By 4 o'clock in the morning, Vance was sitting across from me in my study, placing a fresh stack of intercepted data on my desk. Sydney had been incredibly reckless. In her desperation to maintain her wellness influencer facade, she had failed to properly secure her encrypted messaging applications. Vance uncovered a highly disturbing trail of recently deleted text messages and questionable wire transfers. The funds originated from the last remaining balance of the illicit loan she had taken from the underground syndicate. She had routed thousands of dollars to a corrupt private women's clinic on the outskirts of Atlanta. The digital footprint revealed a frantic exchange between Sydney and a disgraced clinic administrator. She had not simply lied to the police in a sudden moment of panic on my lawn. She had been actively constructing this medical lie for weeks. She knew the federal fraud audit was closing in on Bryce, and she needed an ultimate shield. I read through the printed transcripts of her messages. The sheer cold-blooded calculation required to fabricate an entire human life simply to avoid accountability was staggering. She viewed a fake child not as a blessing, but as a tactical legal weapon. Vance did not just bring me digital breadcrumbs. He brought undeniable physical proof. Through his street contacts, he had managed to secure the actual forged documents Sydney had purchased from the corrupt clinic. He handed me a crisp, high-resolution ultrasound image displaying a developing fetus. The name printed at the top of the scan was Sydney Jenkins. But Vance's digital team had run a reverse image search and traced the file's metadata. The ultrasound was a stock medical image stolen from a public online database superimposed with Sydney's personal information. Alongside the fake ultrasound were forged prenatal health records complete with fabricated blood panels and signed by a physician who was already under federal investigation for medical malpractice. Vance explained her ultimate strategy. Sydney did not just want to avoid a holding cell. She intended to use these forged medical records to extort me for a massive, multi-million-dollar settlement. She planned to file a devastating emotional distress lawsuit against my estate, claiming my financial cutoff had severely endangered the life of her unborn child. She was going to leverage her internet followers to publicly shame me into unlocking the trust funds to provide for a grandchild that did not actually exist. It was a vile, predatory extortion scheme built entirely on a foundation of medical fraud. I held the fake ultrasound in my hand. I felt absolutely no pity for the woman sitting under police guard at the hospital. She had attempted to use the sacred concept of family to hold my wealth hostage. I gathered the fabricated records, the wire transfer receipts, and the text message transcripts. I placed them into a secure leather folder. It was time to introduce Sydney to the full crushing weight of the justice system. As the sun rose over Atlanta, Elliott and I walked directly into the district attorney's office. We bypassed the standard filing clerks and demanded an immediate meeting with the lead prosecutor handling the estate invasion. We handed over Vance's entire investigative file. We presented the wire transfers, the text messages, and the digitally forged ultrasound. The prosecutor reviewed the extortion scheme with absolute disgust. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Sydney's desperate lie was violently colliding with medical reality. The attending physician conducted a mandatory comprehensive blood panel and a pelvic ultrasound to verify the health of the supposedly endangered fetus. The results were instantaneous and undeniable. The doctor formally informed the two police officers standing guard outside her room that the patient had absolutely zero levels of pregnancy hormones in her system. She was entirely vacant. The officers walked into her hospital room, completely stripping away her final illusion. They did not offer her a comfortable bed or an ounce of sympathy. They read her Miranda rights a second time. The district attorney immediately slapped Sydney with severe additional felony charges for providing false statements to law enforcement, obstructing justice, and attempting to perpetrate medical fraud. She was discharged from the hospital in handcuffs and transported directly to the county jail's general population holding cell. The news of her fake pregnancy leaked to the local press within hours. Her wellness followers, who had aggressively defended her just a day prior, turned on her with vicious digital fury. She lost every single shred of public sympathy. She was completely ruined. With Sydney locked in a federal cell and stripped of her voice, the federal investigation into Bryce's bank fraud officially concluded. The bank handed down their final audit. Bryce's newly appointed public defender looked at the mountain of undeniable evidence and made a desperate move to avoid a decade-long prison sentence. Sydney was sitting in the county jail cell, her fabricated medical crisis completely dismantled by the district attorney. With her out of the picture, the focus of the justice system pivoted entirely back to the architect of the original crime. The central bank had taken their time moving with the slow-crushing momentum typical of massive financial institutions. But on Tuesday morning, Elliott called me with the news we had been waiting for. The bank internal fraud department officially concluded their comprehensive audit of the $500,000 equity line of credit. The evidence I had provided to Elliot weeks ago proved to be the exact roadmap the federal investigators needed. The bank executives formally pressed criminal charges against Bryce for leveraging the fraudulent loan against my estate. They did not pursue a quiet civil settlement. They wanted to make an absolute example out of him. The federal prosecutors took the bank findings and built an airtight, unassailable case. They had the digital footprints linking Bryce's personal laptop to the forged signature software. They had the wire transfers routing the stolen equity directly into Sydney, failing wellness brand, and the illegal underground sports betting syndicates. The prosecutors did not need to hunt for missing pieces because Bryce had been arrogant enough to leave a trail of breadcrumbs a mile wide. I had operated under the delusion that his clean-cut image and tailored suits would shield him from genuine scrutiny. He forgot that federal agents do not care about country club memberships. They care about paper trails, and Bryce's paper trail was painted in neon colors. The federal grand jury returned a blistering indictment. My son was no longer just a desperate man running from loan sharks. He was officially a federal fugitive. Bryce had spent the last 3 days hiding in the shadows of Atlanta, terrified of the underground lenders hunting him for his wife's unpaid debt. He had abandoned his luxury lifestyle for the paranoid existence of a hunted animal. But the syndicates did not find him first. The federal authorities did. A specialized tactical unit located Bryce huddled in the back booth of a dilapidated 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. He did not try to run. He did not put up a fight. When the agents approached his table and flashed their badges, Bryce simply slumped his shoulders and placed his hands flat on the sticky laminate table. The sharp click of the handcuffs securing his wrists was probably the most relieving sound he had heard all week. They transported him directly to a federal holding facility. I watched the arrest report hit the local news wire from the quiet comfort of my study. My son was finally locked inside a sterile concrete cell, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit instead of his imported cashmere coats. In a twisted way, the federal government had just saved his life. The steel bars and armed guards kept the violent loan sharks far away from him, but that physical safety came with a devastating price tag. Bryce was now facing a litany of severe felony charges, including wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for his crimes painted a grim picture. I was looking at 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The crushing weight of his new reality finally settled over him. He was entirely cut off from his wealth. His wife was locked in a separate county facility, and his future was reduced to the 4 gray walls of a prison cell. Stripped of his platinum credit cards and frozen out of the family trust, Bryce could not afford a high-powered criminal defense attorney. The man who used to mock my working-class background was forced to rely on a court-appointed public defender. His assigned lawyer was an exhausted, overworked man who had seen hundreds of arrogant white-collar criminals roll through his office. The attorney sat down with Bryce in a bleak visitation room and laid out the prosecution discovery file. It was a massacre. The public defender reviewed the forged signature documents, the bank surveillance footage, and the overwhelming financial data Elliot and I had compiled. He did not sugarcoat the situation. He looked Bryce directly in the eyes and told him that taking this case to a jury trial would be a spectacular form of legal suicide. The federal prosecutors had an absolute mountain of undeniable evidence. A jury would take less than an hour to convict him on all counts. The lawyer explained that the only viable strategy to avoid spending the next decade and a half in a maximum security prison was to secure a massive reduction in the sentencing recommendations. However, the prosecutors had absolutely zero incentive to offer a favorable plea deal. Their case was too strong. The only variable that could potentially sway the judge and the district attorney was the primary victim of the crime. Bryce's lawyer realized that their entire defense strategy hinged on a single desperate gamble. They needed me to drop the pending civil damages and formally request leniency from the court. They needed the father who had been betrayed to stand up and shield the son who had wielded the knife. Bryce's attorney wasted no time. He drafted a formal communication and sent it directly to Elliott Law Firm. The email was carefully worded, dripping with legal desperation, masked as a plea for family reconciliation. The public defender requested a private sit-down meeting between the defense, myself, and Elliott. He outlined his intention to discuss a comprehensive plea agreement that would satisfy the federal prosecutors while sparing the family the public trauma of a highly publicized criminal trial. Elliott called me immediately to discuss the proposition. He read the attorney email aloud over the phone, scoffing at the subtle emotional manipulation woven into the legal jargon. They were hoping my paternal instincts would override my sense of justice. They assumed that seeing my son facing total ruin would soften my resolve. Elliot advised me that I had absolutely no legal obligation to attend this meeting. We had handed over the evidence. The federal government was handling the prosecution. We could simply ignore the request and let the justice system crush Bryce without our involvement. But I did not want to ignore it. I wanted to look my son, legal representative, in the eyes. I wanted to hear exactly what kind of hollow apologies and empty promises Bryce had instructed him to deliver. I told Elliot to accept the invitation and schedule the meeting at his downtown office for the following morning. I put on my best suit, the exact same one I wore when I first confronted Bryce and Sydney in my kitchen. I was fully prepared to walk into that conference room and listen to their desperate negotiations. But I had absolutely zero intention of offering them a single ounce of mercy. The conference room in Elliot's firm was a sterile expanse of glass and polished steel high above the busy Atlanta streets. I sat at the head of the long table, the tailored fabric of my charcoal suit resting comfortably against the ergonomic chair. Elliot sat to my right, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp and constantly calculating. Across from us sat the overworked public defender assigned to represent my son. The man looked completely exhausted, wearing a cheap, wrinkled suit and carrying a thin manila folder that looked downright pathetic compared to the mountain of hard evidence resting in front of Elliot. The lawyer cleared his throat and immediately attempted to set a tone of familial compassion. He did not lead with legal statutes or technicalities. He led with pure emotion, painting my 35-year-old son as a naive, misguided youth. He argued that Bryce was fundamentally a good man, a first-time offender who had simply succumbed to the overwhelming pressure of his socially obsessed wife. He spun a fictional narrative portraying Bryce as a victim of Sydney and her relentless demand for an extravagant lifestyle, claiming the forgery was an act of quiet desperation rather than calculated malice. He even dared to bring up my late wife, suggesting she would want peace rather than a prison sentence. I listened to his carefully rehearsed speech without altering my expression. I did not nod and I did not interrupt. I let him expend his energy trying to convince me that the man who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward was merely a misunderstood boy needing a father's grace. When his emotional appeal concluded, the public defender slid a single crisp document across the polished surface of the table. It was a drafted agreement outlining the terms of his desperate plea deal. The lawyer explained that the federal prosecutors were willing to negotiate a heavily reduced sentence, but it required my absolute cooperation as the primary victim of the fraud. The terms were explicit and insulting. I would have to immediately drop all pending civil lawsuits regarding the estate, the stolen vintage car, and the forged documents. More importantly, I was required to draft and sign a formal letter of forgiveness to the federal judge presiding over the case. In this letter, I would have to beg the court for extreme leniency, citing family reconciliation and minimizing the damage Bryce had caused. If I agreed to this humiliating surrender, the defense could secure a plea arrangement that would keep my son completely out of a federal penitentiary. Bryce would serve 5 years of supervised probation, perform mandatory community service, and pay a fraction of the restitution over a decade. The lawyer leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, attempting to establish a false sense of intimacy. He looked me directly in the eyes and invoked the concept of blood and legacy. He told me that no father should ever actively participate in sending his only child to a cage, arguing that a felony conviction and a prison sentence would forever destroy Bryce's life. He was asking me to sweep $500,000 of federal fraud and a profound personal betrayal under the rug to protect the very arrogance that caused it. I let a heavy, unbroken silence hang in the room for several moments. I looked at the drafted agreement resting near my hands. I did not reach for a pen. I placed my index finger on the edge of the paper and slowly slid it right back across the table until it rested in front of the public defender. I kept my voice incredibly level, completely devoid of any anger or sorrow. I told him that shielding my son from the consequences of his actions is exactly what created this monster in the first place. I explained that for his entire life, I had provided a safety net woven from my own sweat and labor, bailing him out of every minor scrape and financial misstep. I told the lawyer that my son repaid that lifetime of protection by demanding I scrub the mud off his wife's boots, attempting to strip me of my human rights with a false police report, and gambling away my home to save his own skin. I refused to write a single word of forgiveness for a man who felt zero remorse until he was caught by federal agents. I flatly rejected the offer to drop the civil damages. I stated clearly that the trial must go forward exactly as scheduled. I insisted that the truth of his crimes, the forgery, the deceit, and the utter disrespect, must become a permanent public record. I would not allow Bryce to hide behind a quiet probation agreement and pretend he was a victim of circumstance. The public defender visibly deflated his shoulders, slumping, as the absolute reality of my refusal set in. He looked at the rejected agreement, and then at my unwavering expression. He had dealt with angry victims before, people whose rage could eventually be softened or negotiated away with enough time and pleading. But he realized in that moment that he was not dealing with anger. He was dealing with cold, unmovable resolve. He recognized that I could not be manipulated, guilt-tripped, or pressured into saving a son who had tried to destroy me. The plea deal died right there on the table, suffocated by the heavy truth of the situation. He quietly gathered his papers, snapping his briefcase shut with a sound of total defeat. Elliot informed him that we had nothing further to discuss and that we would see him in federal court. The lawyer walked out of the conference room, leaving behind the shattered hopes of a quiet resolution. Bryce would not get a graceful exit or a slap on the wrist. He was now forced to face a jury of his peers and answer for every single federal charge levied against him. The federal court officially set the trial date on the docket, and the wheels of justice were locked into motion with no turning back. With the plea deal destroyed and prison time looming, Bryce's defense team realized they only had one desperate option left. When the courtroom battle begins, they will attempt to completely assassinate my character in front of the jury to save him. The heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse swung open to reveal a room packed wall-to-wall with spectators. Reporters from every major financial news outlet in Atlanta filled the gallery benches. They were all eager to cover the spectacular collapse of a prominent venture capitalist. I sat in the front row directly behind the prosecution table, wearing my tailored charcoal suit. Bryce sat a few feet away at the defense table. He looked small, pale, and entirely stripped of his usual arrogance. His orange jail uniform was a harsh contrast to the life of luxury he had tried to steal. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman with a voice that commanded absolute authority, stood before the jury box to deliver her opening statement. She did not waste a single second. She laid out the exact timeline of my son's catastrophic greed. She presented the jury with a clear chronological map of his illegal underground sports betting debts. She explained how those mounting losses drove Bryce to commit federal bank fraud by forging my signature on a $500,000 equity line of credit. The prosecutor then detailed the most disturbing aspect of the crime. She described how Bryce and his wife attempted to cover their tracks by filing a fraudulent medical conservatorship, actively plotting to lock their own father inside a psychiatric ward. The jury listened with growing horror. The financial records were projected onto large monitors, displaying the exact moment my stolen money was routed to illegal bookmakers and superficial launch parties. The prosecution built a fortress of undeniable evidence right out of the gate. Bryce's public defender looked down at his legal pad, realizing the impossible battle ahead of him. The public defender knew he could not argue with the bank records. The federal paper trail was an immovable mountain. His only viable strategy was to entirely assassinate my character. When he stood up to deliver his opening statement, he pointed a trembling finger directly at me. He attempted to paint a picture of a draconian absentee father who ruled his family with an iron fist. He told the jury that I was a cold, ruthless businessman who hoarded his immense wealth while watching his only son struggle to survive in a highly competitive corporate world. The lawyer argued that I had intentionally set impossibly high standards and provided zero emotional or financial support. He claimed this environment of sheer neglect pushed Bryce into a state of severe psychological desperation. According to the defense, the forgery was not an act of malicious greed. It was the frantic, panicked mistake of a broken son just trying to earn his father's elusive approval. He painted Bryce as a tragic victim of my towering shadow. He suggested that if I had simply been a generous and loving parent, none of these federal crimes would have ever occurred. I sat completely still, listening to this elaborate fiction. I did not shake my head. I did not scoff or display any outward signs of anger. I knew this was the desperate flailing of a sinking legal team. They were trying to manipulate the emotions of the jury to distract them from the hard, undeniable facts of the felony charges. But I was not a man who could be easily villainized. I was simply waiting for my turn to speak. On the third day of the trial, the prosecution called me to the witness stand. I walked past the defense table and took my seat. I swore an oath to tell the truth, adjusting the microphone with steady, unhurried hands. The defense attorney immediately launched his cross-examination, his voice dripping with accusatory hostility. He demanded to know why a man of my considerable wealth would allow his own flesh and blood to face financial ruin. I did not raise my voice in response. I answered him with the cold, methodical precision of a ledger. I presented the court with a detailed record of every single financial contribution I had made to my son over the past decade. I calmly recited the exact figures. I paid for his pristine private university education in cash. I purchased his first 3 vehicles outright. I allowed him and his wife to live entirely rent-free in my multi-million-dollar estate. I covered every single utility bill, property tax assessment, and maintenance cost so he could invest his own income into his business ventures. I looked directly at the jury and explained that I had fully funded every aspect of my son's comfortable life. I had provided an impenetrable safety net woven from my own sweat and labor. The defense attorney's narrative of a deprived, neglected son evaporated instantly into the sterile courtroom air. The jury looked at the undeniable financial records displayed on the monitors. They saw the truth. I had given Bryce every possible advantage a father could provide. I only stopped writing the checks when the disrespect crossed an unforgivable line. The prosecutor stepped forward for redirect examination to deliver the final crushing blow. She asked me to describe exactly what led to the freezing of the trust accounts. I spoke clearly into the microphone. I told the jury about the morning Sydney walked into my kitchen and demanded I kneel on the hardwood floor to scrub the mud off her designer boots. I recounted how Bryce walked into the room and ordered me to serve his wife or get out of my own home. I described the absolute betrayal of discovering they had filed a false police report, claiming I suffered from advanced dementia, just to force me back to the estate. Finally, I detailed how my son attempted to steal my fully restored classic car from my garage in broad daylight to sell to black market criminals. I did not speak with venom. I spoke with the quiet, devastating sorrow of a man who had done everything right only to watch his legacy be trampled by entitlement. I explained that I did not abandon my son. I simply stopped shielding him from the consequences of his own arrogance. When I finished my testimony, the courtroom was entirely silent. The jury watched me step down from the witness stand. Several of them wiped their eyes, visibly moved by the stoic dignity of a father forced to confront his son's monstrous greed. I walked back to my seat beside Elliot. Bryce stared at the floor, completely broken. The defense rested their case shortly after. Knowing they had absolutely nothing left to argue, the judge gave her final instructions. The jury stood up and retired to the deliberation room. The fate of Bryce and Sydney was now officially sealed. The heavy mahogany doors of the jury room remained closed for less than 4 hours. In federal fraud cases of this magnitude, a rapid deliberation is rarely a sign of acquittal. It means the evidence was so overwhelming, so categorically bulletproof, that the jurors did not need to debate the nuances of the law. They only needed to review the pristine paper trail I had laid out for them. The bailiff announced the return of the jury, and the low murmur of the packed courtroom instantly evaporated into a suffocating silence. I took my seat in the front row, adjusting the cuffs of my charcoal suit. Elliot sat beside me, his posture rigid and expectant. Bryce and Sydney were escorted back to the defense table. The sheer arrogance they had paraded around my estate just months ago was entirely gone. Bryce looked physically diminished. His tailored suit hung loosely on his shoulders, his skin carrying a sickly, translucent pallor. His hands trembled so violently against the wooden table that his attorney had to place a steadying hand on his forearm. Sydney was no better. The polished, serene wellness influencer facade had completely shattered. She stared straight ahead with hollow, terrified eyes, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her chair. They were finally standing at the very edge of the cliff they had blindly sprinted toward. The federal judge entered the courtroom, her black robes billowing, as she took her seat at the high bench. She did not look at the defendants with an ounce of sympathy. She looked directly at the jury foreperson and asked if they had reached a unanimous decision. The foreperson, an older gentleman with a stern expression, stood up and held a single sheet of paper firmly in his hands. He confirmed they had. The judge instructed the defendants to rise and face the jury. Bryce struggled to stand, his knees buckling slightly under the sudden crushing weight of reality. Sydney stood beside him, perfectly rigid, looking as though all the air had been violently pulled from her lungs. The foreperson adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the verdict sheet. On the first count of federal bank fraud regarding the illicit $500,000 equity line of credit, he read clearly, "We find the defendant Bryce Jenkins guilty." A sharp collective gasp echoed from the reporters seated in the gallery. Bryce closed his eyes, a single tear cutting through the cold sweat on his cheek. On the second count of aggravated identity theft and forgery, the foreperson continued, his voice projecting across the silent room. "We find the defendant guilty." The hammer had officially fallen. The foreperson then turned his attention to the second page of the document. "On the count of attempted grand larceny regarding the theft of the estate's antique jewelry, we find the defendant Sydney Jenkins guilty. on the counts of providing false statements to law enforcement and attempting medical fraud guilty. Every single charge levied against them by the federal prosecutors and the district attorney held firm. The jury had completely rejected their fabricated narratives of desperation and victimization. They saw through the pathetic attempts to blame a supposedly draconian father. They recognized pure, unadulterated greed. The defense attorneys slumped in their chairs, recognizing the absolute totality of their defeat. There were no split decisions, no hung jury on minor counts, and no room for a technical appeal. The convictions were comprehensive and devastating. My son and daughter-in-law were now officially convicted federal felons, their entire futures erased by a single piece of paper. Federal judges typically schedule a separate sentencing hearing weeks after a conviction, but given the undeniable paper trail and the flight risks demonstrated by both defendants, the judge proceeded with immediate sentencing parameters. She looked down at Bryce and Sydney with an expression of profound judicial disgust. She stated that in her 20 years on the bench, she had rarely seen such a callous, predatory exploitation of familial trust. She highlighted how they had weaponized the legal and medical systems, attempting to strip an innocent elder of his human rights simply to fund an opulent fake lifestyle and pay off illegal gambling syndicates. She told Bryce that his actions represented the absolute worst kind of white-collar criminality. For the charges of federal bank fraud and forgery, she sentenced my son to 7 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Bryce let out a choked, suffocating sob, collapsing heavily into his chair. The judge then turned her sharp gaze to Sydney. For the attempted grand larceny, medical fraud, and obstruction of justice, Sydney received 5 consecutive years in a state correctional facility. The judge did not stop with prison time. She immediately signed an aggressive asset forfeiture order. Every remaining dollar in their personal accounts, every piece of designer furniture they had purchased, and any future revenue generated by Sydney's wellness brand were officially seized by the federal government. The funds would be liquidated to pay back the defrauded bank and the private creditors they had deceived. They were stripped of their freedom, their status, and their wealth in a matter of minutes. They were left with absolutely nothing but the stark gray reality of the prison walls awaiting them. The gavel slammed down, finalizing the total destruction of their empire. 2 armed federal bailiffs immediately stepped forward, pulling Bryce and Sydney away from the defense table. The metallic heavy click of steel handcuffs securing my son's wrists echoed loudly through the silent courtroom. It is a sound that permanently alters the soul of a father. I sat completely still in the gallery, watching the officers lock the chains into place. A profound, incredibly complex grief washed over my chest. I did not feel the triumphant thrill of a victorious businessman. I felt the deep, agonizing sorrow of a parent mourning a child who was still breathing. I grieved for the bright, energetic boy I had raised, the son I had taught to change tires and balance a checkbook. But I knew that boy had died long ago, replaced by a stranger consumed by entitlement. The harsh reality of his imprisonment was the absolute necessity of justice. Shielding him from this moment would have only validated his monstrous behavior. I watched them march Bryce and Sydney through the side doors, heading toward the holding cells. Bryce looked over his shoulder one final time, his eyes searching the gallery for me. I did not look away. I held his gaze with stoic dignity, offering no comfort and no condemnation, only the silent truth of his own making. When the doors closed behind them, I stood up and buttoned my suit jacket. Elliot walked beside me in respectful silence as we navigated the crowded courthouse steps, ignoring the frantic questions shouted by local reporters. I drove my restored classic car back to the quiet sanctuary of my estate. The house felt lighter, cleansed of the toxic ambition that had poisoned its halls. I was pouring myself a glass of water in the kitchen when Elliot arrived at the front door. He walked into the foyer carrying his leather briefcase, but he did not pull out legal contracts or bank statements. He reached inside and produced a sealed, yellowed envelope. He handed it to me, gently explaining it was left behind by my late wife Evelyn, with strict instructions to deliver it only when the storm had finally passed. I poured myself a glass of cold water in the quiet kitchen. The heavy mahogany front door echoed through the hall as Elliot stepped inside. He did not carry his usual thick leather briefcase full of court filings and financial audits. He held only a single aged manila envelope in his hands. He walked into the kitchen and placed it gently on the marble island. I looked at the yellowed paper, noting the official seal of his law firm stamped firmly across the flap. Elliot took a deep breath, his usual sharp lawyer demeanor softening into the posture of an old friend. He explained that my late wife Evelyn had visited his office privately exactly 5 years ago, just 2 months before her passing. She had handed him this exact envelope with a very specific, unbreakable legal directive. I was instructed to lock it in his firm's secure vault and never mention its existence to anyone, including me. The only condition that would trigger its release was a direct, malicious attack on the estate by our own flesh and blood. Evelyn had anticipated the exact legal war we had just concluded. She instructed Elliot to deliver this letter to me only if Bryce ever attempted to steal the home we built or manipulate the family trust. I stared at the sealed flap, feeling the immense weight of her foresight settling over the room. Elliot placed his hand firmly on my shoulder, gave a respectful nod, and walked out the back door to leave me completely alone with her final words. The silence in the kitchen felt different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of betrayal. It was the quiet anticipation of hearing my wife speak to me one last time. I picked up a silver letter opener and sliced cleanly through the thick wax seal. I pulled out 3 sheets of heavy stationery. The moment I saw the elegant sweeping loops of Evelyn's familiar handwriting, a profound ache tightened my chest. It was as if she were standing right beside me, her voice echoing clearly in my mind. The letter did not begin with soft pleasantries. My wife was always a woman of sharp intuition and undeniable truth. She wrote that if I was reading this page, her greatest fear had materialized. She confessed that during the final years of her life, she had quietly observed a dark, insatiable greed taking root deep inside our son. While I was busy expanding the auto shops and managing the business accounts, she was watching Bryce closely. She noticed how he looked at our home not as a sanctuary of love, but as a bank vault waiting to be cracked. She saw the entitlement bleeding into his behavior, the way he treated the staff, the way he sneered at honest labor, and the way he viewed our hard-earned wealth as his absolute personal right. Evelyn wrote that she tried to guide him, tried to instill the values of hard work and humility that defined our marriage, but she realized the rot had gone too deep. She knew Bryce was merely waiting for us to weaken. She understood that his affection was entirely transactional. Reading her sharp, accurate assessment of the boy we raised was devastating, but it also shattered the illusion that I was alone in my observations. My wife had seen the monster hiding behind his tailored suits long before he ever forged my signature. The second page of her letter shifted from a mother's sorrow to a partner's fierce directive. Evelyn begged me never to let Bryce destroy the legacy we had built from the ground up. She reminded me of the early days, the freezing winters we spent patching the roof of our first small apartment, the late nights I came home smelling of motor oil and exhaust, and the countless sacrifices we made to build an empire for our family. She commanded me to protect that legacy at all costs. Her words were sharp and unyielding. She told me that if Bryce ever tried to take the estate by force or deception, I must not let paternal weakness cloud my judgment. She explicitly instructed me to be absolutely ruthless. She wrote that true love sometimes requires delivering the harshest possible consequences. She did not want the fruits of our lifelong labor squandered on illegal gambling debts, superficial vanity projects, or the fleeting approval of high society influencers. Evelyn validated every single action I had taken over the past few weeks. She validated the freezing of the trust, the public eviction, and the absolute refusal of the plea deal. She told me that putting Bryce in a cage was infinitely better than letting his greed destroy everything we stood for. She knew that my instinct would be to carry the crushing guilt of sending our son to a federal penitentiary. This letter was her way of reaching across time to lift that heavy burden off my shoulders. She absolved me of the guilt I did not even realize I was holding on to so tightly. I finished reading the final page and placed the stationery flat against the cool marble of the kitchen island. A deep, cleansing breath left my lungs. The lingering fragments of doubt, the small, quiet whispers of guilt that had plagued me since the judge struck the gavel were completely washed away. I had not failed as a father by holding my son accountable. I had succeeded as a husband by protecting my wife's life work. I walked through the grand foyer of my home, running my hand along the polished banister. The estate felt entirely different. The toxic ambition that Bryce and Sydney had dragged into these halls was permanently evicted. The house was no longer a battleground of deceit and forged documents. It was a fortress of truth. I walked into my study and looked out the massive bay windows at the sprawling green lawns. For the very first time since Evelyn passed away, I found absolute internal peace. I had weathered the ultimate betrayal and emerged completely unbroken. But looking at the vast wealth secured safely in my trust accounts, a new realization took hold of my mind. Securing the money from a greedy son was only half the battle. Hoarding this fortune in a blind trust served no real purpose. I had built my empire to create a better future, and that future had been hijacked by entitlement. With the estate completely secured and my conscience entirely clear, I made a definitive decision. I would ensure that the immense wealth I had accumulated would never have the opportunity to corrupt another soul. It was time to tear down the old financial structures and build something entirely new. I sat across from Elliot in his downtown office for the first time since the trial concluded. The heavy burden that had weighed on my chest for months was completely gone. Evelyn had given me the ultimate validation, and now it was time to honor her final wishes. I instructed Elliot to completely dismantle the multi-million-dollar blind trust that had been the target of my son's immense greed. We went through the foundational documents line by line. I legally and permanently removed Bryce from every single clause of my inheritance. He would not receive a single dime of the empire I had built. Sydney would never see another penny of my hard-earned money. Hoarding this vast fortune in a stagnant account felt like a betrayal of the work it took to earn it. Wealth without purpose is a breeding ground for entitlement. I told Elliot that I wanted to redirect the entirety of my liquid assets to people who actually understood the value of a hard day of work. I wanted to find young men and women who possessed the exact same hunger and determination I had when I opened my first garage, but who lacked the financial safety net to get started. Elliot smiled, his pen moving swiftly across the legal pads. He drafted the new framework with the same ruthless efficiency we used to dismantle my son's fraudulent empire. I was no longer protecting my wealth from thieves. I was preparing to give it away to those who truly deserved it. Within 2 weeks, the legal framework for my new vision was officially established. I named it the Evelyn Jenkins Vocational Foundation, honoring the woman whose wisdom and unwavering support made my entire career possible. I did not want to create a standard charity that simply handed out anonymous checks. I wanted to build an institution that offered permanent life-changing skills. The foundation was specifically designed to provide comprehensive, full-ride scholarships for underprivileged African American youth across the city of Atlanta. These were kids who had the drive to succeed, but were constantly pushed out of traditional educational pathways due to systemic financial barriers. I wanted to give them the exact same opportunity I had to build a legitimate, thriving business with their own 2 hands. The program would offer intense hands-on mechanical training, focusing on automotive repair, modern diagnostics, and shop management. We would teach them how to fix an engine, how to balance a ledger, and how to negotiate a commercial lease. They would not leave the program with a useless piece of paper. They would leave with industry certifications, a complete set of professional tools, and the financial literacy required to open their own shops. I reviewed the foundational charter with Elliot, feeling a profound sense of pride. This was how you build a lasting legacy. You do not hand a fortune to an entitled child who refuses to work. You hand a wrench to a hungry student who is desperate for a chance to prove their worth. To make this vision a physical reality, I needed a proper headquarters. I drove through the industrial sectors of downtown Atlanta until I found exactly what I was looking for. It was a massive abandoned warehouse that had been sitting empty for over a decade. The roof leaked, the concrete floors were cracked, and the windows were shattered. Bryce and Sydney would have looked at the building with absolute disgust. I looked at it and saw pure potential. I purchased the property in cash that very afternoon. I hired a team of local contractors and immediately began converting the decaying structure into a state-of-the-art auto repair training center. We installed dozens of hydraulic lifts, advanced computer diagnostic bays, and fully stocked tool rooms. I designed the layout using the exact same blueprints I used to scale my first successful auto shops 40 years ago. I was not just building a classroom. I was replicating the precise business model that had made me a wealthy man. The goal was to show these young students exactly what a highly profitable, efficient garage looked like from the inside out. I wanted them to walk into the facility and feel the heavy, undeniable weight of professionalism. We built administrative offices where local business owners could come in and teach seminars on taxes, marketing, and customer service. I poured millions of dollars into the renovation, sparing absolutely no expense to ensure the facility was world-class. I was turning my past success into their future foundation. I did not manage the renovation from the quiet comfort of my study at the estate. I woke up at 5 o'clock every single morning, put on my steel-toed boots and my faded flannel shirts, and drove directly to the construction site. I actively supervised every aspect of the build. I climbed the scaffolding to inspect the new ventilation systems. I knelt on the concrete floors to check the leveling of the hydraulic lifts. For the first time in 10 years, I had grease paint and drywall dust under my fingernails. My joints ached at the end of the day, but it was the good, honest ache of hard labor. I felt incredibly alive. I was no longer the silent, isolated old man hiding in an annex while my son squandered my fortune. I was back in my element, purposeful and deeply connected to my community. Local residents would stop by the open bay doors asking questions about the project. I shook hands with neighborhood leaders and hired local kids to help sweep the floors and clear the debris. The dark shadow of the trial, the betrayal, and the crushing disappointment of losing my son entirely faded away into the background. I was replacing the toxic memories of forged documents and police reports with the rhythmic, steady sounds of construction. The warehouse was transforming into a beacon of hope right before my eyes. The final coats of paint dried. The polished tools were hung in their places, and the massive bay doors were finally ready to open to the public. The grand opening of the foundation was about to mark the beginning of a powerful, unstoppable new chapter. The morning sun broke over the Atlanta skyline, casting a warm glow across the freshly painted brick of the newly renovated warehouse. A massive banner hung above the gleaming bay doors, proudly displaying the name of the Evelyn Jenkins Vocational Foundation. I stood on the concrete apron wearing my tailored charcoal suit, looking out at the crowd that had gathered to celebrate the grand opening. The mayor of Atlanta stood to my right, engaged in an animated conversation with several prominent local business owners who had pledged their support. But my focus remained entirely on the 50 young African-American men and women standing in the front row. They wore crisp new coveralls embroidered with their names. Their eyes were wide, filled with a hunger and a determination that I recognized instantly. They were looking at a future that had finally opened its doors to them. I stepped up to the podium. I did not deliver a long, self-indulgent speech about my past successes or the recent family trials that had led me to this exact moment. I spoke about the dignity of honest labor, the value of building a foundation with your own two hands, and the absolute power of financial independence. The mayor handed me a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors. I looked at the bright red ribbon stretching across the entrance of the state-of-the-art training center. I cut the ribbon with a single decisive snap. The crowd erupted into applause. The bay doors rolled up, revealing the pristine hydraulic lifts and the fully stocked tool rooms. Watching those students flood into the facility, eager to touch the equipment and begin their journey, a profound realization settled over me. This was my true legacy. I had successfully transformed my personal heartbreak into an engine of opportunity for my community. I left the foundation in the capable hands of the new instructors and walked toward the parking lot. The chrome bumper of my fully restored 1968 Chevrolet Mustang gleamed brilliantly under the midday sun. I slid into the leather driver's seat, turning the ignition key. The engine roared to life with a deep, muscular growl that vibrated perfectly right through the chassis. I drove back toward the suburbs, taking the long, scenic route through the winding roads of Georgia. I shifted gears smoothly, feeling a profound sense of freedom that I had not experienced in over a decade. I pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates of my estate. The private security system recognized my vehicle instantly, and the metal gates swung open without hesitation. I drove up the long, sweeping driveway and parked the Mustang safely inside the detached garage. I walked across the manicured lawn toward the main house. The property was perfectly still. The rented white leather furniture, the massive ice sculptures, and the suffocating arrogance that had poisoned this land were entirely gone. The hardwood floors inside the grand foyer were polished to a mirror finish. There were no muddy designer boots carelessly discarded by the door. There were no hushed, toxic conversations echoing from the formal dining room. The heavy, oppressive tension that used to dictate my every move had vanished completely. The house felt incredibly light. It was no longer a battleground of deception and forged documents. It was a pristine sanctuary. I walked through the quiet rooms, running my hand along the mahogany banister. I had successfully purged the rot from my life, and in doing so, I had reclaimed the absolute peace and security of the home my wife and I had built together. I stepped out of the back doors and walked across the stone patio toward my private annex. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting a warm golden hue across the sturdy oak workbench. The space was immaculate. Every single tool was exactly where it belonged. My specialized wrenches, ratchets, and heavy mallets hung in perfect alignment on the pegboard. My cedar toolbox, which had once been carelessly tossed into the freezing rain, sat proudly in the center of the room, completely repaired and polished. I took off my suit jacket, carefully draping it over the back of a wooden chair. I rolled up the crisp white sleeves of my dress shirt. I walked over to a stack of raw timber I had purchased earlier in the week. I picked up a solid block of aromatic cedar wood, feeling the rough, natural texture against my calloused palms. I walked back to my workbench and clamped the wood securely into the heavy steel vise. I opened the top drawer of my toolbox and retrieved my favorite carving knife. The steel blade was perfectly sharpened. I pressed the edge of the knife against the cedar block and made the very first cut. The wood curled away smoothly, releasing a rich, earthy scent into the air. I settled into the steady, repetitive motion of the carving. The sharp, rhythmic sound of steel shaving away layers of timber filled the peaceful room. It was a sound of creation, a sound of absolute control. I was no longer a man fighting a defensive war against his own flesh and blood. I was simply a craftsman working quietly, with his hands entirely content in the sanctuary he had fought so ruthlessly to protect. As I carved the cedar block, I allowed myself a moment to reflect on the entirety of the ordeal. The past several months had tested the very limits of my patience, my intellect, and my endurance. I had watched my only son choose the shallow allure of fraudulent wealth over the steady, undeniable value of family loyalty. I had watched his wife attempt to weaponize the legal and medical systems simply to steal the roof over my head. They had vastly underestimated me because I did not raise my voice, because I wore flannel shirts, and because I chose to live simply despite my significant wealth. They made the fatal mistake of confusing my silence with weakness. They learned the hardest possible way that silence is merely the sound of a man carefully calculating his next move. Sometimes the only way to deal with profound arrogance is to strip it away entirely. You cannot negotiate with relentless greed. You must dismantle the foundation it stands on and let the individuals plummet back down to reality. By removing my financial safety net and enforcing the strict, uncompromising boundaries of the law, I had restored the natural order of things. My son and his wife were currently facing the stark gray reality of their federal prison sentences, forced to finally understand the actual cost of their entitlement. Meanwhile, my wealth was actively funding the legitimate futures of dozens of hardworking students. The scales of justice were perfectly balanced. I brushed the wood shavings off my workbench and looked out the window at the sprawling, peaceful estate. The storm had passed, the rot was excised, and the silent adjustment was finally complete. 5 years have passed since the heavy steel doors of the federal penitentiary closed behind my son and his wife. The Evelyn Jenkins Vocational Foundation has grown from a single renovated warehouse into a sprawling, multi-building campus of opportunity. I walk through the bustling instruction bays every single morning. The familiar, comforting scent of motor oil, hot metal, and fresh paint fills the air. I see dozens of young African-American men and women standing exactly where I once stood, holding heavy steel wrenches and advanced diagnostic tablets, building their futures from the ground up. They do not expect handouts. They expect to work, and they do so with a fierce, undeniable pride. Watching them graduate, secure high-paying jobs in the automotive industry, and eventually open their own independent garages brings a deep, resonant warmth to my chest that no corporate bank statement ever could. This is the empire I was always meant to build. This is the legacy my late wife envisioned. Yesterday, the mail carrier delivered a standard beige envelope stamped with the harsh black insignia of the Federal Correctional Institution. I sat at my solid oak desk in my quiet study, looking at the return address. It was from Bryce. In the 5 years of his incarceration, I had not visited him a single time. I had not answered a single monitored phone call. I picked up my silver letter opener and sliced the envelope open with a single clean motion. The letter was 4 pages long, written in the neat, practiced handwriting I had paid private tutors thousands of dollars to perfect. Bryce wrote extensively about the harsh, unforgiving realities of the cell blocks and the crushing, monotonous routine of prison life. He offered apologies that sounded meticulously polished and highly rehearsed. He claimed that losing his freedom had finally taught him the value of honesty and hard work. But a man's true nature always reveals itself if you let him speak long enough. On the final page, the mask slipped. Bryce outlined a detailed, aggressive plan for his eventual release. He suggested that given his background in venture capitalism, he could serve as the primary financial director for my new foundation. He claimed his prison experience had reformed him, and that he was uniquely qualified to manage the massive influx of charitable donations and grant money I had accumulated over the past 5 years. He was sitting in a federal prison serving a sentence for aggravated bank fraud and forgery, yet he still believed he was fundamentally entitled to hold the keys to my vault. He viewed my charity not as a means to help the community, but as his next personal piggy bank. I did not feel a sudden surge of anger. I felt a profound, absolute clarity. I realized a new fundamental lesson that day. I folded the letter and set it calmly on the polished surface of my desk. The lesson was about the dangerous, deeply ingrained illusion of blood obligation. For decades, society has aggressively pushed the narrative that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred unwritten contract that requires infinite forgiveness and endless financial rescue. In our community specifically, the pressure to constantly uplift every relative who refuses to climb on their own often drains the hard-earned wealth of those who actually put in the grueling labor. We are conditioned to believe that cutting off a family member is a supreme moral failure. We are taught to endure disrespect simply because we share a last name. I learned that cutting off a toxic family member is not a failure. It is the ultimate necessary act of self-preservation. Blood does not demand your self-destruction. DNA is not a legal license for financial exploitation and emotional abuse. Bryce did not genuinely want redemption. He simply wanted a new accessible avenue to exploit my resources. He had swapped his imported cashmere suits for a coarse prison uniform, but his core underlying entitlement remained completely intact. If I had yielded to paternal guilt, if I had let the heavy burden of societal expectations force me to reply to that letter or offer him a lifeline, I would have invited a dangerous predator right back into my sanctuary. I learned that true generational wealth is not measured by the raw dollar amount left behind in a trust fund. It is measured by the strength of the personal boundaries you establish and the character of the people you choose to empower. I chose to empower disadvantaged youth who deeply respected the daily grind. I refused to empower a son who respected nothing but his own vanity and greed. Later that afternoon, I drove my restored classic Mustang to the quiet rolling hills of the local cemetery. I parked the car and walked up the paved path toward Evelyn's resting place. I brought a fresh bouquet of white lilies, her absolute favorite flower. I knelt by the polished granite headstone and brushed a few fallen autumn leaves away from her engraved name. I spoke to her in the quiet stillness of the memorial park. I told her about the Foundation's massive success, about the students who were breaking generational cycles of poverty with the tools we provided them. I told her about Bryce's letter and the audacity of his demands. I felt a gentle, reassuring breeze sweep across the hillside. I knew with absolute certainty that she was proud of the unyielding stance I had taken. I had successfully protected the fruits of our lifelong labor from being squandered on illegal gambling debts and superficial influencer parties. I had defended our shared history. I took the 4 pages of Bryce's letter from my breast pocket. I did not leave them on the grave. I walked back to my estate carrying the physical reminder of his arrogance. I stepped out onto the stone fire pit on my back patio. The evening air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. I struck a match and held the bright orange flame to the edge of the paper. I watched the rehearsed apologies and the hidden financial demands curl into black, weightless ash. The wind caught the remnants and scattered them away into the darkening twilight. I felt zero regret. I felt the pure, unburdened lightness of a man who has officially paid all his debts to the past and severed all ties to toxic manipulation. I walked back inside my quiet, immaculate home. The hardwood floors shone brightly under the warm, ambient lighting. The upgraded security system blinked with a steady, reassuring green light near the entryway. There were no rented white leather couches taking up space in my living room. There were no arrogant whispers echoing down the hallways. There were no muddy designer boots tracking utter disrespect across my floors. There was only the profound, unshakable peace that comes from knowing you have finally mastered your own domain. I am Clifton. I am 75 years old, and I have finally learned that the most vital structure a man can ever build is not made of brick mortar, steel, or money. It is made of unbreakable, uncompromising self-respect. You are never too old to evict the people who poison your peace, even if they share your blood. You are never too late to redirect your legacy toward those who will actually honor the sacrifices it took to create it. True power does not shout, it does not argue, and it does not plead. True power recognizes its own immense worth and silently removes anyone who fails to respect it. Did you find value in my story today? Please let me know which city or country you are watching from in the comments below. I always look forward to seeing how far these life lessons travel. If you appreciate a story about setting firm boundaries, protecting your hard-earned legacy, and fighting back against toxic family members, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your continued support allows me to keep sharing these powerful experiences. Take care of your peace, guard your wealth, and I will see you in the next video.